Good morning. Hello, good morning. Please come and take your seats. Welcome to the second day of our 2026 Spring Symposium on Democratic Resilience. Yesterday was an incredible set of presentations and conversations which gave us a bird's eye view, and I think a very nice understanding of the state of democracy worldwide and some of the theoretical ways of understanding backsliding in a contemporary context. And today we have a finely grained set of presentations which will be a really nice complement. We have an exciting set of panels. First, we will hear from student fellows who have spent the year in Clough Center programming and seminars and who have authored articles for the Clough Center Journal, copies of which are on the table over there. Immediately following that, we will be led by Eric Owens in a panel on the theme of civic education. Eric is the Director of International Studies at Boston College and the Director of the Program on Global Ethics and Social Trust. After that panel is when we'll have our coffee break. And then finally, we will have a closing keynote lecture from New York Times opinion columnist Ross Douthat. So first we will hear from this panel of Clough Fellows led by Senior Research Fellow Chandra Mallampalli. Professor Mallampalli is a historian of modern South Asia whose scholarship and teaching span the fields of modern India, the British Empire, world history, and global Christianity. We are very fortunate that he served as lead editor for the Clough Center Journal for the second year in a row. Thank you, Chandra, and please take the podium.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our panel, which is devoted to celebrating the launch of the 2026 edition of the Clough Journal. As Jonathan mentioned, I'm a senior research fellow at the Clough Center, and I'm part of the editorial team that has had the privilege of reading just the outstanding contributions of our fellows this year. And I think if you haven't gotten a copy, your complimentary copy of the journal, I strongly encourage you to pick one up. So every year, the Clough Center produces an edition of its journal that's centered on the annual theme. This year's annual theme, of course, is Democratic Resilience. And every year, the journal includes contributions from guest speakers, participants in the fall colloquium, and a range of faculty affiliates. And if you go to your journal, you'll see that there are some shaded inserts that contain the special contributions of people who have come through the Clough Center, and we have transcribed their presentations so that they could be in print form. But really the highlight of the journal and what we really want to showcase is the outstanding work of our fellows that are coming from a range of disciplinary backgrounds, range of experiences, and have really produced very thought-provoking essays that are included in this year's journal. So we're going to be hearing from them in addition to talking about, maybe providing a synopsis of their articles. A couple of them were participants in the trip to Bogota, Colombia, where they interacted with state officials, people involved in civil society, building civil society, and we've asked them to share a couple highlights from that visit as well. So we will first be hearing from Allison Demmons, who is a senior in the Morrissey College of Arts and Sciences at Boston College, where she majors in political science and psychology. She will be followed by Maria Alejandra Gutierrez Torres, who is a Colombian medical doctor with a major in public affairs and minors in political science and management, and a master's in peace building. She is currently a PhD student at the Boston College School of Social Work. After Maria, we'll hear from Austin Lamb, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science here at BC. And then would come Curran Shestag, who is a senior at BC pursuing a major in history, go Curran, and a minor in religion and American public life. Last but not least, we will hear from Kate Schultz, a first-year PhD student in applied developmental and educational psychology here at BC. So without further delay, I'm going to turn the floor over to our presenters, and we will hear from them, and we'll have some time for some follow-up questions as well.
So thank you, Professor Malampali, for that wonderful introduction, and good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be here today, both as a representative of the Clough Center's undergraduate fellows, and to speak briefly to the theme of democratic resilience. I hope to do this by drawing on my publication for this year's journal, examining the democratic implications of the Supreme Court's increasing use of the emergency docket. In considering this issue, I'm not referring to the broader shadow docket, which encompasses the vast majority of Supreme Court activity. Rather, the emergency docket constitutes a narrower category, distinguished by a need for expedited relief. In these cases, the Supreme Court subverts the standard process of case percolation through the lower courts, prevent irreparable harm. Cases treated in this manner may be handled by single or multiple justices and may or may not be accompanied by signatures and written opinion. This method of redress has faced elevated scrutiny as universal injunctions have become increasingly common, halting executive action on a nationwide scale. However, despite this cause of increased attention, I do not wish to limit my analysis to the court's mediation of universal injunction. As suggested by the court's reasoning in AARP versus Trump, the assumption of broad putative classes during litigation can itself preserve avenues for federal policy stagnation. Thus, although the emergency docket may have instigated this new salience, it is not reducible to this parallel question. Consequently, today I hope to address the democratic implications of specifically an expanded reliance on emergency docket decision-making. To do so, who better to consider than two pillars of my Boston College political science education, Alexander Hamilton and Alexis de Tocqueville. As most of you will recall, in Federalist 78, Hamilton described the judiciary as the branch that exercises neither force nor will, but merely judgment. It is precisely this characterization that is strained by increased treatment via the emergency docket. Emergency docket cases do not require written opinion. In other words, the court may issue consequential rulings without an explicit constitutional justification. This is not to say that in emergency docket cases, the Supreme Court abandons its fidelity to the Constitution. Rather, I argue that without formal written judgment, which reflects reasoned conformity with the nation's highest law, there is no means of verification. Emergency relief orders therefore strain the obligation to judgment placed on the Supreme Court by removing mechanisms of accountability. Consequently, regardless of the legal soundness of the decision rendered, the court risks departing from the narrow duty to exercise merely judgment that Hamilton thought essential. For Tocqueville, the judiciary was also bound to the Constitution. However, he attributed a slightly different value to this dependency, the stabilizing force of precedent. He argued that the personal interest of lawyers is dependent upon their mastery of that occult science of law and its jurisprudence, their prestige contingent upon preserving and working within that intricate and extensive body of doctrine. This renders their self-interest a force for moderation and stability. Legal professionals preserve precedent not only because it is institutionally proper, but because it is the source of their authority, status, and office. This sustained commitment offers continuity, a bulwark against democratic vicissitudes. However, it is this relationship which is challenged by increasing reliance on the emergency docket. In the 2020 case of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn versus Cuomo, the court not only enjoined New York from enforcing its executive order and reversed the lower court decision, but called for further evaluation in light of this decision, arrived at without full investigation or oral argument. As a result, a decision rendered under time pressure to prevent immediate harm extended its influence well beyond the narrow circumstances that instigated such haste. Under this method of review, not only is the Supreme Court distanced from precedent, but it perpetuates this reasoning to lower courts, violating the slow, precedent-bound nature of the courts Tocqueville thought essential. In this way, while Hamilton clarifies how this shift may strain the court's duty to judgment, Tocqueville illustrates how it may weaken the judiciary's role as a moderating institution within democracy. both functions central to democratic resilience. However, so far, this evaluation has been largely theoretical, a consideration of how systems should function and how a shift in procedural treatment violates this ideal. But the ramifications are not merely abstract. As the court itself acknowledged in Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania versus, quote, "The court's power lies rather in its legitimacy, a product of substance and perception that shows itself in the people's acceptance of the judiciary as fit to determine what the nation's laws mean and declare what it demands. The court's practical authority depends not on force, but confidence. It is such confidence that is threatened by a shift away from the modes of judicial reasoning Hamilton and Tocqueville each, though in different ways, defend. When decisions are issued through opaque procedures without full argument and sometimes without reasoned opinion, the public is given less basis on which to regard those decisions as credible. Studies affirm this erosion, showing that participants consistently view cases treated on the emergency docket as less legitimate than those resolved under standard merit review. And these perceptions of decreased legitimacy in turn erode perceptions of the court's institutional legitimacy. This erosion is particularly significant because the court has no independent power of enforcement. It relies upon the public recognition of its authority, and that recognition is inseparable from the belief that the court is acting in a manner consistent with the constitutional order from which its power is derived. If the judiciary appears to depart from judgment, from precedent, and from procedural regularity, it risks weakening the very legitimacy upon which its authority rests. And in such a state, it is reduced in those capacities Hamilton and Tocqueville thought essential. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So I am Maria Alejandra Gutierrez Torres. I'm going to present you a kind of a paper, but also a project that I really loved, so I hope that you like it as well. So the name is A Democracy That Survives, not by ignoring its failures, but by facing them. So I did have like some slides, but I'm going to go through them. So actually the question that Colombia, that is my country, forces us to ask is that Colombia has sustained a democratic governance for over a century. However, Colombia has been in an internal war for more than 70 years. We have had like 20% of the population affected and directly affected by armed conflict, more than 80,000 children that are still being recruited, more than 50,000 kidnappings, more than 4,000 massacres. We have a lot of not that great numbers. However, we still have elections, we still have power transfers, we still have oppositions, they actually exist, and institutions are amazing in Colombia. They function so well. So, as we have been studying this year, and as we talked about it in Bogota, there's a lot of political science frameworks, and even thinkers, and even philosophers that talk about like how we should assume peace as a baseline or as a prerequisite for democratic institutions to work. However, as we see in Colombia, Colombia defies this assumption because it has never experienced a prolonged dictatorship such as our neighbors have. For example, Argentina, Chile, Brazil. We haven't had a revolutionary upheaval such as Cuba, Nicaragua, but this leads us to think like, how does democracy survive? Not in spite of conflict, but through conflict. What does democratic resilience actually means and actually looks like when violence is not an exception, but a persistent condition, as it is happening in Colombia. So, asking this, it got me to find this amazing philosopher, Colombian philosopher. His name is Ross Douthat, and in his book that is called Education and Democracy, he talks about how democracy is not just elections, constitution, or formal rules. This is kind of a minimalist view of democracy, as he poses it. Actually, democracy is what a society learns to inhabit. It is reflected, actually, in everyday experiences, in the relationships, and in the habits through which people actually coexist. So he talks about three baselines, philosopher Zuleta, that the first one is equality of real opportunities, that is actually being able to access, for example, education. Genuine participation, that is not only going and vote, as we did last week in Colombia, but also actually being part of a community. And finally, deliberative coexistence, that is actually having the willingness of accepting pluralism, as it still happens in Colombia. So this led me to think that actually democratic resilience is the collective ability to sustain this lived democracy under pressure. It includes institutions, of course, and we have great institutions in Colombia, but it is the repeated choice to continue building a common future through dignity, dialogue, and shared responsibility, even amid conflict, violence, scarcity, and trauma, as it has happened in Colombia. So as you can see, like in the journal, the example that I used for this was an example of a project that I have been working quite a while that is called Juntos. But now, for this presentation, I am using the Bogotá example, what we lived in Colombia. So what did I witness in Colombia? So we have been studying as doctoral fellows for quite like almost a year, what is democratic resilience through different readings, seminars, and even like lectures, discussions. But actually, Bogotá was like an example of how this concept is not just theories, but we lived it. We saw it. So Colombia, institutional architecture changed a lot in 1991 because we changed our constitution. The last constitution was built in 1886, but in 1991 we changed it. And now we have like a strong oversight bodies, we have an opposition institute, we have horizontal accountability, and we even built a constitutional court. This is what I call architecture of resilience. It is not like the absence of threats, but it is actually the presence of institutions as a response to these threats. So what happened in Colombia? What we saw is that actually institutions are fundamental, but as Stanislao Zuleta says, they are not the only thing that actually build democratic resilience. The moral weight of conflict itself was actually what Father Francisco de Rú, who was like the president of the Truth Commission in Colombia, he's so important in Colombia because he and his team were in charge of actually building the truth of Colombia, having thousands of testimonies throughout the country. And he asked us something that was super powerful, and it was, how was it possible that the country kept moving forward? Universities continued classes, business made profits, churches held masses, while all of this was happening in Colombia, while a lot of people were being killed in Colombia. How did an entire society turn away from what it already knew? And afterwards, after these powerful questions, we had a panel, and it was the most powerful moment that we lived. Even some of us cried and everything, because we had in a panel former FARC commander, who's called Francisco Londoño. FARC was the oldest guerrilla group in the world. Former military officer implicated in extrajudicial killings, which are called falsos positivos. And actually, when he introduced himself, he was like, okay, so I actually killed more than 80 people. And in his side, we had a victim who was actually one of the victims of this former military officer. And it was amazing because they sat together in a panel. And what this showed us is that we transcend the legal processes, you know? The profound act of this shared truth is actually like a lived experience of democratic resilience. So what does this mean? It is that resilience is a living practice. Democratic resilience is not a concept to be defined. It is a concept to be lived, to breathe. And often it is an imperfect reality. And Colombia is the perfect example for this. It shows us that democracy can survive, not by ignoring its failures, because we do have a lot of failures, but by gradually and even painfully sometimes building the structures needed to face them. Resilience is not optimism. We do need optimism, of course, but resilience is what remains when optimism is tested, as it has happened in Colombia. It manifests daily in the lives of Colombians who, right now still, they keep navigating through conflict. They keep reconstructing what has been destroyed, and they persist in believing that the future can differ from the past. So my conclusion is actually the sustainable peace building. That is actually what I work on. It's a mix of safeguards institutions, but also of the daily conditions that enable people to actually practice democratic resilience. Day after day, in the very place where war has tried to make that impossible, such as many zones in Colombia. So that was my final slide. Thank you so much. These are some of the amazing pictures from our trip in Colombia. So thank you for having me here.
All right, thank you to Professor Malampalli, my fellow panelists, and everyone gathered here today. I wrote about what I think is a central tension in liberal democracy. In theory, democracy is the rule of the people. As H.L. Mencken put it, democracy is the theory that the common people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard, which is to say public opinion rules. But in practice, the rule of people is mediated by representation and institutional structures, which is to say something other than public opinion rules. So what should we do when public opinion conflicts with constitutional rights, with expert policymaking, or with other institutional restrictions? Today, we see this problem in debates over populism and the administrative state. My article looks back. It looks at this problem through the lens of a very similar debate that took place about 100 years ago. This is the Lippmann-Dewey debate, an exchange of books and articles between the journalist Walter Lippmann and the pragmatist philosopher John Dewey. My argument is that this debate reveals a conflict between democratic ideals and democratic practice. So today I'll very briefly recount that debate and try to draw some lessons from it about democratic resilience. Ultimately, I find that public opinion works best when it stays within the bounds of the constitutional rule of law, because it's that constitutional structure that makes public opinion possible in the first place. So to get some idea of who Walter Lippmann was, imagine if Ezra Klein and Ross Douthat sort of fused into one person, and both conservatives and liberals were required to read him. It was mandatory. And also that this kind of super Klein went on secret diplomatic missions for the president. That's sort of Walter Lippmann. This debate began with Lippmann's book, Public Opinion, which came during a period of great social change, which many saw as a crisis of democracy. Lippmann was the first to use survey data in this way to show that ordinary citizens have poor access to political information and little time to devote to it. In light of this finding, he argued that we need to de-romanticize our view of democracy. This idea that public opinion always knows best, that the common people always know what's right, it's a stereotype, which stereotype is a term that Lippmann himself invents in this book, just like he later invented the term the Cold War. And this stereotype doesn't fit with the facts. Because of this, Lippmann thought, we should see election results not as these great vague policy mandates from the people, but more modestly as votes of confidence in candidates who take responsibility for their own proposals. We need help from experts, too, to gather facts, identify complex problems, and inform political leaders about the problems at hand. But the power to decide on the basis of those facts, that's a political power that should stay with elected officials. So the key idea here is that elected leaders need to follow the rule of law and bear political responsibility themselves for their successes and failures. They can't shunt off this responsibility, Lippmann thought, to a populist folk mind or to an opaque bureaucracy. So Lippmann would oppose a cumbersome administrative state, but he would also oppose the idea that populism is a coherent response to the problem of expertise and public opinion. You can't throw out the rule of law in order to restore the rule of law somehow. But our problems are also so complex that we really do need some kind of expert administration, or at least guidance. So Lippmann's lesson here is that we need to protect both a realm of vigorous political contestation. We need to keep the political central, but also we need to keep our constitutional system and those experts that are part of that makes that contestation possible. Now, on to Dewey. John Dewey, who is perhaps the most influential American political philosopher and a founder of the pragmatist school of philosophy. Lippmann's book inspired Dewey's only work of formal political theory, The Public and Its Problems, it was called. So Dewey agreed with Lippmann that the world is too complex for government by public opinion alone. But he also thought that Lippmann's solution was not democratic enough. It gave too much power to experts and not enough to ordinary people. Dewey wanted a participatory democracy, comprised not of enlightened experts, but an enlightened public, right? Dewey wrote about education a lot as well. Public enlightenment was the way we would reconcile these things. So where Lippmann said that the public is a phantom, Dewey said that there is a public, but that it needs a new political science in order to come into being. This new political science, Dewey's, is meant to collapse the distinction between natural science and moral philosophy in favor of natural science, such that moral and political disputes are to be solved by pragmatic experiment. It also understands democracy, much as what I gather as Douthat does, as an ethical ideal, as the aspiration for a society in which individual freedom and communal flourishing do not conflict. Experts won't rule over others because expertise will rule over everyone. Sounds nice, right? I like Lippmann better. Am I stupid? Not really. Not totally. Basically, I think there are two reasons to be suspicious of Dewey's solution. The first is that there's a big difference between Dewey's idea of democracy as an ethical ideal and real-life democracies. Dewey's ideal of democracy is like the Platonic form of a cat, this divine idea that defines catness and in which all cats participate insofar as they're cats. The trouble is you can't pet the form of a cat. So Dewey wants to get rid of our religious idealization of established institutions. But his examples of things we should stop idealizing are, quote, the Constitution, the Supreme Court, private property, free contract, and so on. But these are the things people mean when they say democracy, right? That's the fur. Second, Dewey's limitation of moral thought to the terms of his new science is incompatible with pluralism. For Dewey, there can be no conflict between individual freedom and group loyalty. And for this reason, groups whose values are insufficiently democratic or scientific are excluded. Now, can a free and diverse people accept that bargain? I would say no, not if they want to remain free and diverse. Dewey's vision of participatory democracy, it appeals to our love of equality, our belief that ordinary citizens should participate in government, and our taste for the practical sciences, which Tocqueville identified. But it leaves out conflicting values that make political democracy possible, our commitment to the rule of law, pluralism, freedom of thought and conscience. So Dewey doesn't hide these trade-offs, but he doesn't insist on them either, and it takes a realist like Lippmann to identify them sometimes. So I'll close with a brief word on our trip to Colombia. We had the privilege of meeting former President Juan Manuel Santos, who received the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating a peace deal that ended decades of conflict. Now, when Santos took that deal to the people for approval and referendum, they voted it down. And he accepts that result, and he goes back to the negotiating table, and he keeps fighting for peace. So with this in mind, I asked him how he saw the responsibility of a democratic leader to do what is right, even when it's unpopular. He told me he was elected with a massive approval rating, 86%, plebiscite numbers, but that he was popular because he was the defense minister in the previous administration who led the war effort, and he wanted peace. Now, opening peace talks split his party, spent lots of his political capital, and it drew his predecessor into open opposition. Santos said his resolve was strengthened when he imagined himself standing in front of his own grave. What will it say? How much blood will be on my hands if I don't make peace now? And that higher horizon put everything in perspective. If you do not do what you think is correct, he said to us, you will not do anything worthwhile. Now, Walter Lippmann once said that of all the presidents he met, only Teddy Roosevelt was lovable. I doubt Lippmann would have loved Santos. You never really get over your first love, but I think he would have really liked him. There is a man who respects the rule of law and knows when to ignore public opinion in order to do great things for the sake of democracy. So you can have the best constitution in the world, but without virtuous, resilient leaders, you will not have a resilient democracy. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to my fellow panelists, and thank you to Dr. Malampalli. My contribution to the journal was a brief examination of the American occupation of Japan following the Second World War. I settled on the topic for two reasons, largely. First, the relevance that the rhetoric of regime change and state building has today in today's news headlines. I'm thinking, of course, in the situations in Iran and in Gaza with the Board of Peace. And then secondly, because of the direct tie I see between American state building efforts, especially in the 21st century, and democratic resilience. American attempts at regime change have often attempted to establish democracies, especially in the 21st century. And those attempts to create democracy gives us a brief and rare moment into American planners and policymakers' ideas of what actually is requisite to create something that they hold so dear in another state. But of course, in the 21st century, the ideas that come to mind are largely examples of failure. I'm thinking of Afghanistan and Iraq. And so I set out to look at Japan in large part because Japan, in my opinion, is an example of a strong, resilient democracy. Today, such sites as Freedom House actually rank Japanese political rights and civil liberties as higher than those in the United States. And critically, since 1952, at the conclusion of the occupation, Japanese democracy has relatively maintained itself, which I think is relatively remarkable. Of course, during the Second World War, Japan was ruled by militarists and ultranationalists who sought to create a greater East Asia Coast prosperity fear. So my article essentially attempted to offer a qualified answer as to what went right from 1945 to 1952 in creating a resilient democracy. And I came up with three key aspects. The first was the devastation of Japanese society, both physically and critically psychologically, that led to a desire for change. Japan had been at war since 1937. The U.S. didn't enter the war until 1941, and the U.S. also had a far larger reservoir of manpower, was far more economically advanced, and had more economic resources at its disposal. By 1945, Japan was militarily devastated. Allied firebombing had claimed some 500,000 lives in Tokyo alone. And then, of course, we can't underestimate both the psychological and mental and physical impacts of the atomic bombs. And so when General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Tokyo in 1945 to establish an occupation regime, he was fearful of essentially guerrilla warfare facing a hostile state, and instead he was welcomed as essentially a liberating hero. The Japanese people were so tired of war, so hungry for change that it gave democratization efforts a kind of kickstart in the process. The second aspect I focused on was the interesting tension between American hubris, honestly, and vision in their aims in demilitarizing and democratizing Japan, but then also their pragmatism and pretty blatant coercion in making sure those aims were accomplished. I focused largely on the development of a constitution in Japan, a constitution that remains relatively unchanged to this day, including the famous no war clause that essentially removed Japan's ability to hold a standing army. The Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, which was the office that organized the occupation, was initially willing to let the Japanese political elites carry out their own reform of the Meiji Constitution that had held true through the Second World War. But the product, in General Douglas MacArthur's view, was not liberal enough. And so he essentially took 20 American civilians, put them in a room, and had them write a brand new constitution that was far more liberal and far more Western in its ideals for Japan. Now, that document was edited and adopted by the Japanese, largely because they had no say in the matter. But at the same time, American planners made sure to leave room to allow Japan's political agenda to retain a sense of its own Japanese character, especially through the handling of the emperor. The emperor was, in American eyes, a constant link to Japan's quote-unquote feudal past, and as such, on the surface, would appear to be something as necessary for reform. But instead, MacArthur and his planners made every attempt to exonerate the emperor from all war guilt, seeing the emperor as a linchpin of Japanese social continuity and social structure, and as such could not be removed. So those the interesting interplay there I thought was unique. And then the third element I highlighted was the economic stability that Japan's place in American Cold War policy brought about with the reverse turn in 1947, in which case planners like George Kennan came to power at the policy planning staff and began to see Japan as a necessary ally for allied, or for American Cold War geopolitics, Japan was to be a bulwark against communism in the Far East, and as such, American planners began to focus more on economic stability. They focused on attempting to They attempted to focus on rearming Japan, even though they had just written a constitution, attempting to revoke Japan's ability to be an aggressive power. And above all, they funneled money into the Japanese economy, which I think bought Japanese democracy time above all else. With the Japanese economy under such American oversight, they were able to essentially internalize, in John Dower's term, democracy and make it its own. And so, to conclude, I think my largest takeaway from this work is that democratization is not easy. I see all three of those elements as something that's pretty hard to replicate, and all three happened in a unique confluence at a moment in time. And so I think that's something that we should be wary of today. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. So my name is Kate. I'm from the Lynch School of Education, so my presentation is going to be a little bit different from a lot of the history that's been talked about today. But for my article, I looked at early and inclusive participation, specifically examining Scandinavian models of strengthening democracy through autonomy-focused early educational experiences. And my passion for this was I actually worked in Denmark this summer, and then through the fellowship was able to go and meet with a lot of different researchers, specifically looking at democratic education in early childhood in Sweden. So I'll draw a little bit on those experiences, but first I'll talk a little bit about the literature review I conducted for this project specifically. So there's a growing body of research that illustrates that civic education, especially in early childhood, a lot earlier than you might think would be valuable, forms the leaders of tomorrow. And by leaders of tomorrow, I don't just mean politically engaged citizens or students that grow up to sort of go through the passive motions of what might be considered like the bare minimum of participation, but rather research shows that these students have more internal political efficacy and are more pro-social when they have these experiences early in their classroom. And so what I looked at specifically was both in Sweden and Denmark, they have early childhood education curriculum that adopts an integrated approach where they specifically foster greater autonomy of students. They facilitate dialogue that encourages disagreement in the classroom. And they also have more shared decision-making of the students by the students, rather than a teacher imposing sort of a passive choice option with those students. And in terms of my own research, this aligns with Vygotskian conceptualizations of co-created learning, which has been shown to scaffold students' sense of purpose in the classroom, but also extends beyond that, into their personal lives as well. And something that Chandra helped me when we were editing this project together was that this still occurs in the United States. Obviously, Scandinavia ranks very highly on global indices of democratic participation and democratic resilience. However, there's also a lot of social and economic factors at play of why that might occur. But when we break it down to just looking at early childhood specifically, in the United States, there's been some really positive programs, such as the Tools of Mind, High Scope, Teaching Tolerance, Kindness in the Classroom. But what's interesting when you compare those against the programs that are occurring in Scandinavia that have such positive results, these programs focus a lot less on civic formation and more on social emotional regulation, which is also really important, but definitely satisfies a different need in terms of facilitating democratic citizens. And it's often framed as behavioral management strategies of giving students choices to help them, be kind to one another, which is obviously essential to a thriving democracy as well. But there's less facilitation of disagreement, and there's also a lot less choice of students by students, because obviously that can cause a lot of disruptions and problems in the classroom, but has been shown to be really effective in these other countries. And basically a lot of this research in Scandinavia has looked at how early democratic education, even as early as our equivalent of elementary school, increases levels of complex moral reasoning and conflict resolution skills among children. And so one example that I found really maybe the most impactful conversation I had with scholars abroad was there was this project in Sweden called Playful Democracy. And what was interesting about it was I come from a psychology and human development background, but the lead of this project was actually an architecture professor, and his work specifically looks at how like urban spaces can foster greater democratic participation by adults. But for this, he transitioned and worked with a lot of like curriculum designers in Sweden and also like early childhood researchers. And they designed this program that was implemented within schools where students had a voice both on what issues mattered to them. They did like a march through town and created posters based on issues that you might not normally identify, like using kind words matters. That was one of the posters, which I thought was awesome. So that connects back to this moral education piece. But having them, use their voices in a politically peaceful way, but, really showing up and having their voices valued was a really important part of the evaluation of the efficacy of that program. They also, in terms of the architecture, put them in a large room, like I think it was about this big, with cardboard boxes, and had them design their like ideal town and facilitated dialogue on like, well, what other things do you need that might scaffold the common good or support us as a community, but you're not necessarily needing, because if they're in 5th grade, they don't need a retirement home center, but maybe that's really important for their community because their grandparent does. And so that was like really interesting to have them think about what democracy means and also what it means in terms of designing a community. And what's really cool is at the end and the conclusion of this whole curriculum, they had them design like what they think would be needed for a town hall. And now they're making the town hall in Sweden. So it's supposed to be done in 2028, but it's based off of the design with input from adult architecture experts in order to make that and facilitate that process. And so not only was it an impactful program in terms of the educational outcomes, but it also created something that is real in like the real world beyond the classroom, which is really impactful to students. And then the one other thing I want to talk about that is slightly separate from like the moral education and democratic conversations that occur in early childhood education, and hopefully will be adopted more globally as this research grows, is the democratization of science. And in the Lynch School, I work a lot on this NIH-funded study called Brain Healthy that works with students. It called it a citizen science program, but actually we've veered into terminology now of community science because a lot of the students that participate in high school and middle school in New England and New York are not citizens in the United States. And we want to make sure that they also feel included, especially since that's the point of the project. But they contribute real data about their brain health in a non-invasive way to a nationwide database through the project, in addition to learning about the brain basis for healthy behavior and how exercise can stimulate blood flow and all these other positive aspects of the curriculum. But what's really interesting is they're contributing to a citizen science database that's like bigger than themselves. And they get to analyze this data as well. So they're involved with that throughout the scientific process. And then this summer, sort of on a different but related note, we actually conducted some cross-cultural research examining how students conceptualize their own participation in these programs. Because in Denmark, they have an even bigger program than ours, where they actually look at climate change education. And through their programming, they have students take, it's called eDNA, like environmental DNA, from waterways. And then they analyze the DNA in a lab to detect species in the water. And that's a way that they can monitor biodiversity and the impacts of climate change over time. But the sample size is quite larger than you could ever fathom having with just a skilled team of researchers. The skilled team of researchers is there fostering the whole process, but they end up being, valuing the students' input, and then all of their research has turned into academic publications, and the students are credited as contributors. And so what we're looking at is like, how does that facilitate more meaning? And so I think to conclude, based on all these, really impactful programs that I've had the opportunity to collaborate with and learn from, on a global scale, it's really important to value students' voices and value their contributions to science to increase things like scientific literacy and greater participation. If we want a resilient democracy, we need resilient young people as well. And so it's really important to make sure we have an educated and informed populace, but also that we have inclusive participation for everyone. Thank you.
Each of you for absolutely captivating synopsis of your contributions to the journal, very effectively presented and very compliant with the time constraints that I mentioned earlier. We have some time for some Q&A, but I thought I'd get us started with an icebreaker type of a question. And it's really asking you to reflect on your year as a Clough Fellow and, of course, the process of writing your article. Do you think these events of this year and your article have made you more optimistic about democratic resilience, or has it made you more aware of the challenges and the weight of those challenges? You're free to stay in your seats and use the mic in front of you, but I thought that would be it's a broad question, but I thought it would get us started with some discussion of your great contributions.
Hi, yeah. Well, I think that, I don't know if it's more optimism as I was talking. Thank you so much for your question. I don't know if it's more optimism, but I think that I now see like the complexity of democratic resilience, I would say. And not only like in theory, because it was super complex understanding it throughout a year, but it's also super complex in practice, as we were talking about in Colombia and a lot of examples, Japan and everything. I would say that, of course, I now understand it better, but I would say also that something that gives me hope is how, and we were talking about that yesterday as well, how actually the institutions, we consider the institutions as like ships to actually reach democratic resilience. And we value how institutions are so important, but in the same case, how people are actually fundamental in this case, not only for them being resilient, but for them practicing democratic resilience in their everyday life. So kind of giving me a more realistic sense of what it is and how complex it is.
Thank you.
Yeah, Sartre said hell is other people, and he was mostly wrong about that. And what I mean by saying this is that when you're alone in your room and you're reading your books and you're reading the news and you're thinking about the state of the world and the direction it's going, it's very easy to get very pessimistic very quickly. And one of the virtues of being a part of something like the Clough Center is that you're speaking with other people from other disciplines who are just as committed to this and are very bright and are doing a lot of work that you didn't even know was going on, and suddenly you're kind of not alone in that anymore. And I don't want to speak for your other disciplines, but we can get pretty insular in political science. And so, going to weekly seminars and seeing your faces and hearing about what you were doing was quite uplifting. And then, let alone the Colombia trip, where we got to see a nation that was in a place, a much worse place than we are, but who managed to stay resilient nonetheless. So the idea that extraordinary things could happen becomes less ridiculous when you see others who are trying to make those things happen.
Yeah, something I would say is I think it's very easy to consider democracy as the thing that we are in. It's a one-directional train. It's the state of affairs. It's all I've ever experienced. And for that reason, it's kind of always forward-looking. It's what am I doing now? What am I doing tomorrow? And I think something that this experience has offered me is something, kind of the 2,000-foot view of what is democracy, where has it failed, what does it look like in other places. And with that perspective, I think it's much easier to be critical and to really consider and be contemplative about what we mean by democracy and what we aspire for in democracy, as opposed to really kind of taking where we are as just what it is, as the water that we swim in. And I think that there's a lot of kind of critical thought that emerges when you kind of remove yourself in the environment that Clough offered. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think building off of what everyone else has said, one thing I'll add is it was really inspiring, as Austin mentioned, to hear from so many different scholars doing very different research that relates to democracy. I think it's easy to be very pessimistic, especially as in our current political climate, like funding gets cut for a lot of initiatives we work on, especially in like diversity education. There's a lot of cuts. And so I think that having others to lean on as like a source of hope and inspiration and support is really integral. But I also think it's interesting to think of like next year's theme, I think, is like democracy at scale, and think about how like our conversations are small, but they're about big things. And so I think that that was inspiring in me in terms of like thinking about how research in one community could apply to research in another community. And if like, for like what work I do is like global scientific literacy is something really valuable, especially in an era where data science is even more important for the workforce. And so if you start that early, it's really valuable. So I think like hearing from everyone else in the cloud community has been really helpful.
Yeah, I touched a little bit on this in my talk, but I think a little bit separately from my co-panelists here. I think working on my article really opened my eyes to how difficult, especially democratic state building can be, which obviously is different from democratic resilience, where we've had democracy in the U.S. since its inception. But it's given me a new appreciation for what it takes to build a democracy, and how that is different across different states, different cultures, different religions, I guess. So yeah, I think I just have a greater appreciation of how we need to look at democratic resilience.
Right. Thank you so much. Well, you've got a small taste of what goes into the journal, and there are many more contributions from our fellows in the journal. But I'd like to take this opportunity to open it up to the floor for other questions. We have one way in the back.
Yes. What does it take to motivate the youth? So, for example, during the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, many of the youth rallied, shut down campuses. But when it came to the how many young people died over in Iran back in January, not one college campus, nobody rallied or supported the young people over there. So what does it take to motivate young people for unjust policy issues, not policy issues, but unjust things that happen around the world?
Okay, so when I was doing my master's in peace building, thank you for your question. When I was doing my master's in peace building, it was so complex because we were always seeing these massacres and how they continue happening in Colombia. But I do think that what kept us there doing these masters was I do think as my work as a moral imperative, I do think that it's something that we need to do, because if we don't do it, then who will? We are like the youth here, and we have to believe in this, otherwise who will? So I do think that always keeping in mind that this is a moral imperative, and that our work is a moral imperative for the future, it's something that keeps me believing and going, even if we see the news and we see everything that's happening right now in the world, and specifically like for myself in my country. I would say that. I don't know if you want to add something.
Yeah, I think also there is, and maybe this is somewhat more of a hot take opinion, but I think that there's a responsibility of educators to encourage their students to be active participants of democracy in a peaceful way. I grew up right outside of Washington, D.C. in a pretty intense political time in high school, and I remember everyone would take the metro, which is the public transit line in D.C., to the Women's March, and then the Climate March. There was a bunch of, and then the March for Our Lives. So there was a bunch of marches, and it was very much a hot topic of oh, are these kids going to be penalized more than if they just missed school because they were sick or they had a doctor's appointment or something else? And so I feel that was a decision by a public school administration that they had to weigh heavily, because it obviously sends a ripple effect of what they value and what they don't in the school. And they ultimately decided that it would be an unexcused absence for fairness, but it wouldn't be necessarily more severe than if you missed for some other reason, because you're exercising your own right to choose what is important to you and what is important to stand up for. And also it was funny, some teachers encourage students oh, well, we'll just have a half-hour class if you make it back by 6th period or something like that. So it was a little bit of a shorter March day. So I do think that it's not necessarily everyone should, feel empowered, and it's a very difficult thing to do, I think, to stand up for those things, especially in the face of barriers when you don't have as accommodating of an institution. But I think that there are certain areas where individuals can hold that power and like use it responsibly and adjust accordingly.
Thank you. I think we can go to another question. How about right there? Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. My question's for Allison specifically. Really thought your analysis of the emergency docket was super interesting, and I'm curious in terms of democratic resiliency and building that, if it gave you a perspective on any of the proposed Supreme Court ethical guidelines, improvements in terms of thinking about term limits or retirement ages being mandatory, or also more stringent guidelines on gifts or other ethical norms, if any of those seem like a potential fix or something to consider. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for your question. I think I would say that the problem with the emergency docket arises probably before it even reaches the Supreme Court, in the sense that we have such kind of an active executive and active federal government that when these injunctions are issued, there is kind of this universal stopping. And I think that that kind of is the first concern. I think when you look at court reform that would be effective specifically on this issue, I think you have to look more broadly at what are their obligations to written judgment, and so what on, obviously ethical term limits and things like that are relevant to larger court legitimacy, but specifically looking at where the court is able to speak to issues when they're making decisions, like in the case of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn, and they're issuing these rulings. Are they saying, what is the precedential quality of this? Is it quasi-presidential? Is it fully precedential? Or is it not? And I think really the first step is the court offering clarity on that question. The court has kind of condemned the lower courts for not following what they're hinting at in these emergency docket decisions, and then almost also simultaneously said these aren't precedential. And we have kind of Justice Barrett speaking to kind of this notion of a lock-in effect of, well, we just start moving in this direction, we're treating it as if it's precedent when it's not. And so I think the first step would really be the court offering clarity on how lower courts are supposed to be viewing these, and then secondarily with the larger legitimacy question, what do we want for the courts? I don't know that it's necessarily kind of speaks specifically to this issue, but I do think it is relevant to that larger legitimacy question.
Back from Professor Beiner.
A question for Karen, though, if anybody else cares to respond, I guess it's also good. I mean, the case is unique. Oh, not unique, it actually exposes one of the major paradoxes of democracy building from the outside. Imposing a constitution on people, imposing democracy on people from outside, writing the constitution for them is, of course, a paradox. That's supposed to come from the people, right? And one could argue that it was a unique moment in 1945 where democracy beat fascism. It was a kind of a moment which was clear. Happened also in Germany, by the way, in West Germany and in a few other places. But clearly what it depends on is not so much the imposition, but like you said, the willingness to accept it. And therefore the crucial people are people who mediate in between, not those who wrote the constitution per se or put in the order, but those who explained it to the people. One could argue in Germany there was already a democratic tradition which people could count on. They could count on those people coming out after Nazism. In Japan, and in other cases, if we look at this as a model, who are the people that you lean on to do this mediation if there isn't such a strong tradition before that?
Yeah, thank you for your question. And you're completely right. And the Americans who wrote the Constitution for Japan were definitely aware of this paradox as well. MacArthur went on record a number of times as saying that the Constitution and the democratic principles that were taking hold in Japan were springing freely from the minds and the collective soul of the Japanese people, which of course is stretching it to say the least. But it was actually, I would say it was the common people in Japan. I would say the ones who were most ardently opposed to the constitution that had been imposed on them were the old hand elite conservatives in the Japanese government and in the Japanese Diet at the time, who had not been purged by 1946. They essentially saw the occupation as something to be meekly withstood until the Americans left, and then they could take back power. And that actually ended up being essentially what happened. But before that happened, the common man in Japan actually became very, very in favor of democracy, largely because of what I talked about as the first part of my talk, which was how sick they were of war and how tired they were of the ultranationalists and the militarists that had been in control since the 1930s. And so it was really the common man, the average Joe, for lack of a better term, that did most of the work in internalizing and accepting democracy.
All right, we have a question from the front.
Hi, friends. Really great presentations. Thank you. Maybe for Austin and Maria about the Colombia example, I'm really interested in this idea around, I mean, you talk about the Colombian president in a way sort of overriding the will of the people to save democracy in Colombia from itself, maybe. And I wonder if there aren't more examples of democracies that have fallen into autocracy because there was a singular person or party that believed they knew more or better than the will of the people, and how we reckon with providing leaders with that ability to make what they believe to be moral decisions, and in ways that we, looking back now, agree with what they've done. We believe that was a good decision that this president made, but also that same freedom allows other leaders potentially to make decisions that end up being harmful and move democracies like our own further toward autocracy, and how you kind of reckon with that in these arguments.
Thanks for the question. It's very interesting. I guess where I would start with it is that this formulation of the leader saves democracy from itself doesn't totally describe the case of Colombia. I mean, there are a lot of mitigating factors, such as when this referendum was voted down, it was voted down extremely narrowly. And the same day the referendum took place, there was a hurricane that messed with the election infrastructure for a significant segment of the Colombian population. And that area that hurricane hit was expected to vote in favor of the peace agreement, right? And that President Santos's response to this was not to say, I know the will of the people better than this election, so I'm going to overrule it and do a peace anyway. That's exactly what he doesn't do. He respects the result. He goes back to the negotiating table. He negotiates a different treaty. And then he comes back, and this time it goes through Congress rather than through referendum, which according to the Colombian legal system was perfectly acceptable. So I think that is itself, there's an important lesson to be drawn there, which is that Santos doesn't take that populist turn. He respects the institutions, and he fights for peace anyway. But he does so in a way that respects the basic legitimacy of those institutions, and he does it with great care. What I meant to highlight was just that, and I think this is something that is admirable that more democratic leaders need to, it would do them well to mimic, was that he didn't take this referendum, this signal from public opinion, as decisive, right? You as a democratic leader, you do what is right within the bounds of the rule of law. I think that's the image that I wanted to highlight.
And I would just like to add, I completely agree with Austin. I do think that the perfect example for that will be our neighbors, Venezuela. I'm not an expert in the institutions in Venezuela, but in Colombia we have had more than 6.8 immigrants from Venezuela. And what I can see in Colombia compared to the rest of Latin America is that we have this strong institution. So for example, we were reading about how ex-president Álvaro Uribe was trying to re-elect himself for the third time, but because we have so strong institutions, he couldn't do it. Then also, for example, our president right now, Gustavo Petro, has been trying to change the constitution constantly, and he cannot do it. Even if a lot of people like him, a lot of people do not, but he cannot do it because we have everything so strongly embedded in the institution. So I would think that will be kind of my answer for your question. Yeah.
Right. We should probably conclude by thanking our outstanding panelists. And certainly, okay.
To domestic?
I'm going to start with Carol.
Are we just going to stay here?
You can sit where you want to move. No, it doesn't matter. I feel like it, but I feel
We're only talking for 7 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like you probably want to go to the podium.
Yes. Okay.
And so I think I'll do Carol and then Peter and then Bo and then Mary.
Okay.
Okay. And I have a. I know you guys are good on time. I'll sit here. I'll sit here and have a little 1 minute. Everything runs fine. If we need to, but I'll count down to like 7.5. Okay. I'll give you a minute.
All right, I did time it, but you never know these things.
Yeah, no problem. We just want to leave time for
It's going to go fast.
Hi, Peter.
Yeah.
I'm going to let you go second.
Okay.
So, just not that it matters.
Yeah, it doesn't.
And we'll have people speak from the podium. And then we'll come back
Hi.
to questions and answers.
You too.
Okay, everybody, thank you for rejoining us today. Please grab your coffees and refreshments and whatever and come back and join us. We'll get started here in just a second. All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this panel on educating for democratic resilience. I'm grateful to the Clough Center for the invitation to contribute to what's already been a terrific conference. Yesterday was really stimulating, and this morning's conversation with the grad students on the panel was awesome too. So thank you all for putting this on. My name's Eric Owens. I'm the director of the International Studies program here at Boston College. I teach in the theology department, and I have an affiliate faculty appointment in the Lynch School of Education in their new formative education department, which will come into play in our conversation, I hope. Citizenship education, or civic education, is often framed as the process of conveying knowledge, skills, and dispositions that are conducive to citizenship of whatever sort one thinks is good. And of course, the conceptions of good citizenship vary widely across a community, across a country, and around the world. And what are the characteristics of a good citizen? What do citizens need to know? What do they need to know how to do? What civic virtues should they embody? What can we learn from the choices that other countries make on these questions? Civics classes in high schools used to be the paradigmatic examples of civic education for democratic citizenship in this country. Teaching students about the branches of government, the federal system, the checks and balances, the Bill of Rights, etc. And there's much to say about such classes, and indeed, knowledge of our system of government is severely lacking today, as it has been for a long time. And students need to know why our government was created and et cetera, et cetera. But of course, education for democracy extends well beyond the specific topics of instruction offered by secondary schools. Students are shaped and citizens are formed by the values that we encourage in schools. This Spring Symposium on democratic resilience is on democratic resilience, and one might argue that what we need now is literally to teach resilience, perhaps some form of what Angela Duckworth famously calls grit, as a civic skill or virtue that can help us maintain our liberal democracy in challenging times. But other knowledge, skills, and virtues are likely to be more directly impactful, and we'll be discussing a number of them in the hour ahead. In some cases, as Professor Ferrara will discuss in a few minutes, National civic education curricula can center on developing conformity to cultural or patriotic norms. This is under discussion in the Trump administration around the new patriotic education initiatives. While in other cases, it can emphasize individual autonomy. Students are also shaped by the ways in which they're educated, like service or community-based learning, for example, by the subjects and skills they're not taught, what's left out purposefully or not purposefully, by the often unspoken values and norms that are conveyed through school routines, teacher interactions, and classroom climate, the sort of thing Philip Jackson called the hidden curriculum of our schools. And students are also influenced by the very structures of the educational system itself, as we'll hear from Professor Fernandez in a few minutes. All of this is true of higher education as well, and we'll hear more about that from Professor Churchill in a couple minutes. And also crucially, democratic education takes place beyond the school entirely and across our lifetimes. The media, of course, play an important role, maybe perhaps Ross Douthat's podcast among them, as do civic institutions like museums and advocacy groups. We heard from ACLU President Nadine Strossen yesterday on this, and we'll hear more about this on education for civic engagement from Professor Levine. Each of our four panelists will bring a different perspective on these questions, allowing us to see the challenges of education for democratic resilience in a variety of ways. We have about 1 hour for our panel this morning, and we'll leave 20 minutes for conversation among the panelists and with the audience. So each of our speakers will take 7 to 8 minutes for their remarks. I will offer a brief introduction to each speaker in advance of their remarks, but for a longer biographical sketch, please refer to pages 15 to 17 of your program guide. We're going to start with Professor Carol Ferrara. She's an anthropologist, assistant professor, and graduate program director in the Marketing Communication Department at Emerson College. Her research has focused on the intersection of religion, education, and national identity. She's published several articles and book chapters about religious education, private Muslim schooling, and secularism in France, most recently, Muslim and Catholic experiences of national belonging in France with Bloomsbury Academic Press as part of the Islam in the Global West book series. Her most recent research project has focused on family experiences with Boston's K-12 school choice system, and she'll soon begin a new comparative research project on religious education, religious literacy, and national belonging in the US and France. Please welcome Carol Ferrara.
Thank you, Eric. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me today. So I am approaching this from a French perspective, and I want to start with a quote. If the school is education, if it is an important national institution that proposes not to watch over a child in order to teach him to sign his name, but to shape his soul and his mind for the patriotic and national cause, can it remain narrowly restricted in a way until this moment you have considered adequate? Setting aside the question that's being posed here, this is Jules Ferry from the 1880s during the establishment of the modern French education system. And this idea of education in France being for the patriotic national cause remains true today. So in the Third Republic, when Jules Ferry was speaking and making this claim, this was really, education was highly linked to the project of state building. And schools were seen as this institution for citizen making and a deep, seeding deep-rooted patriotic sentiment to avoid the sort of clashes and resistance to that state centralization project. So today, French education remains highly centralized. Despite the sort of anomaly where the French government actually funds religious education, so that's a sort of side note, all of the schools, all of the public education schools across the entire nation, and all of the state-funded private schools teach the same curriculum. So it's really different from the US. It's highly centralized. And that means they have significant power in the kind of curriculum building, citizen-making project that they have over there. Another aspect of the French education system that was built, in the 1880s and that remains today is it's highly paternalistic. There's this idea that the school is really the place where education takes place, not the family, which is being contested by a small minority in France that push for independent schooling and sort of, Montessori methods and other other ways of teaching, but it remains a minority. And this was reinforced in 2021 when the state put in place the mandate of 3-year-olds have to now go to school, public school. So it's a mandate. You have to send your child to school at 3 years old, which is the youngest in the world, aside from Hungary. The other aspect of French education that's notable is that it was established, and this was, again, the ideology of Jules Ferry, it was meant to be the great equalizer, where the school would build national unity over diversity. So this is over diversity of regional cultures and social conditions in the country. And it was not just about the imparting of academic knowledge, but it was specifically designed to foster a kind of Franco-conformity. And this was to prevent the regional differences. There were still other languages that were being spoken and taught in Brittany and in different pockets of France. And this was to try and suppress that diversity and try and create a holistic, centralized state. So part of this project of conformity included the full secularization of schools, or famously becoming a school without God, which took place slowly over the 1880s. And the idea was to assimilate all French citizens into a common, secularized French culture. And this idea, again, has really stuck with us. So in a 2003 speech, former French President Jacques Chirac said that the French school was a Republican sanctuary. So a sanctuary against, right, a pure institution where there was no diversity. Everyone is French, right? This really Franco-conformity sort of myth. And the common values were being taught. Since 2015, all public schools and state-funded schools, again, the private schools, teach a newly designed civic and moral education project. And this is not like the project that we heard about from the student who was speaking before, where we're playing with education and setting up boxes, which sounds delightful, by the way. But this is really, in the French schools are known also for being particularly strict, very factory-like in terms of the education, not a whole lot of creativity in the ways of methods that are being taught. And so it really is civic and moral education designed around this idea of secularism and a general Franco-conformity message being taught. This was also, I should note, this was always part of the French curriculum, but it was newly designed after the Charlie Hebdo attacks of 2015. And so there was this big pressure to make it better, stronger. And to, again, push secularization. Secularism became the fourth part of the motto of the French state. So égalité, liberté, fraternité, and then laïcité, or secularism, became the fourth part. So again, this emphasis on a secular Franco-conformity today continues to persist in the education system. And this is despite France's deep cultural, religious, and ethical plurality. Most of you probably know France has one of the highest Muslim populations percentage-wise in Europe, with nearly 10% of the country being Muslim, large part due to its colonialist legacy. During my previous research, students would tell me that religion was taboo in the classroom. They weren't allowed to talk about religion. And so what I argue is that means that these civic and moral education classes, where they're not allowed to talk about religion, they're not allowed to talk about like the deep plurality that actually exists outside of the classroom, it means that it's a necessarily sterile and theoretical application of these lofty values rather than a practical understanding of how to navigate the realities of daily civic life. I've argued elsewhere that France's education system writ large, including the state-funded private schools and the independent schools that I mentioned, that it does allow for, represents a kind of agonistic pluralism where even certain actors who reject Republican democratic principles, secularism, and the modern state entirely, so here I'm talking about the Society of St. Pius X, I visited those schools, they are still allowed to play. They are still allowed to have their independent schools. So I argue that does represent a sort of agonistic pluralism that could foster potentially democratic resilience and some kind of pluralistic vibrance. However, in other respects, especially given the inequities built into who and what can be part of this pluralistic vibrance, France's democratic resilience remains at significant risk. For example, Muslim students often face significant othering in public schools. And in addition to this, the private Muslim schools that have tried to sort of establish themselves in the image of the Catholic school model face major hurdles, inequitable hurdles, in establishing themselves, and have recently had many contracts revoked entirely. So basically, I argue that unless France is able to culturally decolonize and find ways to fully recognize and embrace its diversity, France's education system will continue to perpetuate social, cultural, and regional inequalities, hindering the flourishing of a democratically resilient youth. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Carol. Our second speaker will be Professor Peter Levine, who teaches political science and philosophy at Tufts University, where he directs the Tufts Civic Studies major. In the domain of K-12 civic education, he was a co-organizer and co-author of a number of seminal reports on American education, including the Civic Mission of Schools in 2003, the College Career and Citizenship, or C3, Framework for State Social Studies Standards in 2013, and Educating for American Democracy Roadmap in 2021. The first two of those are sources of the quote-unquote 6 promising practices and the notion of taking informed action that are widely found in state and local policies and educational curricula across this country. Peter's the author of 8 books, including most recently, We Are the Ones We've Been Waiting For, The Promise of Civic Renewal in America, and What Should We Do? A Theory of Civic Life from Oxford in 2022. Thank you for being here, Peter.
Thanks so much for having me. This has been a great conference. Of all, though, I particularly appreciated the student panel. That was really rich and very, very professional and very, very well done. So all my work for more than 30 years has been based on the theory that democracy is more resilient, to use the title of the conference, when many people belong to self-governing autonomous associations, also diverse in the form of the associations. That was de Tocqueville's basic insight about the US. It's been subsequently developed by important political theorists and philosophers like John Dewey, who Austin name-checked earlier, or Hannah Arendt, and others, and also explored empirically by important illustrious social scientists like the late Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in economics for this work, or Robert Putnam, or at BC I have to name Kay Schlossman and her colleagues. So the theory, again, is that democracy is more resilient when more people belong to self-governing autonomous associations. I believe in that. It's not an article of faith. It's just a useful model. It does not always turn out to be empirically correct. After all, democracies depend on many things, not simply on associations. We heard about that from the student panel. And not all associations support democracy. Some of them attempt to undermine it. But the model does often explain phenomena that we observe in the world that are important. And more important to me, it often generates practical insights that we can actually act on. Basically, by strengthening associations, we can improve the condition of our democracy, or we could say the resilience of our democracy. It's a lever or handle that we can pull. Let me give you one example of an empirical finding, just really to illustrate the pattern. So in the most recent available American National Election Study survey, which is 2020, they asked several questions that could measure civic participation. Here's one, quote, during the past 12 months, have you worked with other people to deal with some issue facing your community? That could be seen as a measure of Tocquevillian participation. Have you worked with other people to deal with some issue facing your community? The NES also asked some items that could be seen as measures of democratic values or democratic resilience. So here's one. They asked you to agree or disagree. Much of what people hear in schools and the media are lies designed to keep people from learning the real truth about those in power. And by the way, you might think that's true and that it's not bad that people said so, but everything I'm saying is contestable. I'm taking it to be a bad sign for democracy if people think that all they hear from schools and the media in their lives. People who, in that survey, who participated in groups, who worked with neighbors and so on, held a much less hostile view of schools and media than other people. That's just a correlation. If you control for education, age, gender, race, and ideology, that pattern remains. So people who look different in other ways, if they participate in groups, they're more likely to trust major institutions. And I'm particularly interested in ideology. So ideology actually disappears as a predictor of distrust in this model. So I'm talking social science here, but what it means is that irrespective of ideology, people who work in groups are more likely to trust schools and media. Here's another measure, which I know is controversial. I don't mean that you should necessarily agree with it, but from my perspective, approving of Donald Trump in 2020 is a bad sign for resilience of democracy. I acknowledge fully that a person could vote for him in 2020 for a bunch of reasons, policy, agreement. But appreciating his leadership, I think, is a bad sign for democracy. Debatable. But what I want to share here is that in that same survey, people who worked with others on community issues strongly disliked Donald Trump. As you might expect, conservatives were more likely to approve of him than liberals. But again, once I control for whether you participate in a group, conservatives are no different from liberals in their approval of Donald Trump. Wipes out the difference. So those are just selected statistics. Also, your taste in that kind of research might vary. It's fine. You shouldn't be persuaded by statistics like that all by themselves. They could be cherry-picked. They're debatable, but the reason I share them really is not because they're persuasive on their own, but because they illustrate the much more common patterns that are central to the work of Eleanor Ostrom and Robert Putnam, Kay Schlossman, and many others. So if we follow this theory, what does it mean for education? Well, first of all, I want to say to form and sustain groups requires know-how, practical knowledge. Traditionally, the way people gained that knowledge was by growing up around successful organizations. So you just saw how they ran. But such experience has become rare in the United States and in some other countries as civil society has shrunk. U.S. schools, contrary to what some people believe, U.S. schools do still teach American history and civics. But they tend to focus on how the government works, and they don't regularly teach how to manage effective groups. Meanwhile, changes in the economy and the media, especially social media, have created new challenges for actually running voluntary associations, which means that even if you did learn from experience the know-how that would have worked 30 years ago, it might not work anymore. So this is an educational challenge. How do we learn to manage groups? The weakness of associational life has been evident recently. I'll give you an example. Again, it could be described as somewhat partisan, but I think it generalizes beyond the values that are underlying my example. So when Donald Trump was elected president in 2016, in that election, right afterwards, early 2017, informal groups popped up almost everywhere. They often attracted people who had never been involved in politics before. They were stereotyped in the media as suburban white women, and that was probably statistically true, and they bore the name the Resistance, right? About 500,000 of them attended the Women's March in Washington, which one of our students mentioned, and another 5 million marching in their home communities. So that was a lot of activity. But the resistance proved evanescent because the nascent groups mainly encouraged their members to support famous large national organizations, a small number of famous national organizations. So 350,000 people donated to the ACLU in one weekend early in Trump's first month as president. What the groups were doing was basically sending messages to give money to the ACLU. People also shared and encouraged each other to follow news from national media. So digital subscriptions for the New York Times and the Washington Post tripled. And a bit later, many of the same people supported Democratic Party candidates, once that was an election cycle. But the generosity and energy of these groups did not build local associations. Most, not quite all, but most of the nascent groups just faded away. Erica Chenoweth and Zoe Marks have observed, that we have no established organizational infrastructure based on that experience. I was going to talk a little bit about Minneapolis and whether that's a counterexample, but I think I ran out of time. So it's a promising sign, I was about to say Minneapolis is a promising sign, but associations remain too weak, too few Americans have the necessary practical skills. I think schools and colleges should devote more attention to teaching the nuts and bolts of effective groups in the classroom as well as in experience. I would also love to teach millions of older adults how to do those things, but that's really hard because millions of adults are not in educational settings, and it would be hard to build them. One thing I'm experimenting, I'll just mention briefly, and it actually exists, but it's a pilot. At a pilot stage is a artificial intelligence-driven help desk that helps a nascent group to actually organize itself. The target for this is people we're calling alarmed complete newbies, ACNs, and the help desk gives them a bunch of tools that they need to actually operate. And the theory here is both that by making it easier for a group to operate, we can just help them to get to business, but also that they can learn from that successful experience some of the more fundamental principles of self-organization that we need as a democracy. Thanks.
Terrific, thank you so much. Our next speaker is Raul Fernandez, who's a senior lecturer in educational leadership and policy studies at Boston University's Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. Dr. Fernandez is a public impact scholar who studies, writes, and teaches about inequities in education. As the executive director of Brookline for Racial Justice and Equity, he rallies his neighbors in the relentless pursuit of racial and economic justice. While chair of DESE's Racial Imbalance Advisory Council, he co-authored Racial Segregation in Massachusetts Schools, the first report in a generation to evidence the substantial and pervasive disparities between segregated white and non-white schools in Massachusetts. He's also served as a member of the Brookline Select Board as the first Latino elected to that position. His academic pursuits have focused on how policymaking through the courts, state legislatures, and the federal government impact education, policy, and practice. Welcome, Dr. Fernandez.
Thank you so much. Hey, everybody. When we talk about democratic resilience, we often focus on institutions. Constitutions, courts, elections, and those matter. But democracy does not live only in institutions. It lives in people, in how we see each other, how we understand difference, and whether we believe we are part of a shared public. And that raises a fundamental question. Where do we learn how to live in a democracy? For most of us, the answer is in school. Schools are one of the first places where we encounter people outside of our families. They're where we begin to form our understanding of who belongs, whose voices matter, and what fairness looks like in practice. Which is why, in these United States, school segregation poses such a profound threat to democratic resilience. I spent a lot of time studying this issue as chair of that Racial Imbalance Advisory Council, a public body created by the state legislature here in 1965, which recently released the report, Racial Segregation in Massachusetts Schools. Now, in Massachusetts, a state often celebrated as having the best public schools in the country, we found something deeply troubling. More than 100,000 students attend what we call intensely segregated non-white schools, where more than 90% of the students are students of color, typically with most living in varying degrees of poverty. And the conditions in these schools are not equal to the others, far from it. Compared to intensely segregated white schools, students in these schools face stark disparities across nearly every available measure. Higher rates of suspension and chronic absenteeism, alongside lower graduation rates, lower college-going rates, and lower test scores. And we should be clear about what this means. These disparities are not accidental. They are the predictable result of policy choices. And they function, whether intentionally or not, to limit who has access to opportunity, power, and voice in our society. When students are systematically denied access to high-quality education, we're not just shaping their academic outcomes, we're shaping their ability to fully participate in our democracy. We're shaping who votes, who leads, who is heard, and who is left out. And the burden of that exclusion falls disproportionately on students from under-resourced communities, particularly students of color. This is the first problem of segregation. It is about unequal access to opportunity. It is about harm that is immediate, measurable, and unjust. But there is a second problem, and it is also connected to democratic resilience. Segregation doesn't just concentrate disadvantage, it also isolates experience. In Massachusetts and across the country, white students are the most segregated group. Most white students grow up with little sustained, meaningful interaction with peers from different racial and cultural backgrounds, and that matters. Because democracy depends on our ability to engage across difference, to listen, to disagree, to recognize the humanity and legitimacy of people whose lives are not like our own. These are not abstract skills, these are learned behaviors. And when students are educated in isolation, they have fewer opportunities to develop them. One implication is what I call the racial dialogue gap, a gap in our ability to talk about race across race. And that gap doesn't stay in schools, it follows us into adulthood. It shapes how we vote, how we make policy, and how we allocate resources. It shapes whether we can see inequity clearly, or whether we dismiss it because we have never experienced it, or never even encountered it up close. So when we talk about democratic resilience, we have to recognize this. A segregated education system produces a segregated civic imagination. And that is dangerous for a democracy that depends on shared understanding and collective decision-making. I want to be clear about something. The solution is not assimilation. The goal is not to erase difference or expect students from historically marginalized communities to conform to dominant norms. You hear a different argument in our politics today. Vice President J.D. Vance recently argued that a society must cohere, build a common identity, and ensure that people assimilate into a dominant culture before it can function well. But that vision mistakes uniformity for unity. It assumes that the path to cohesion runs through sameness, that difference is a threat to be managed rather than a reality to be engaged. But what if the greater risk is not too much difference, but too little shared experience across difference? What if the real threat to democratic resilience is not diversity, but segregation? And history should make us deeply skeptical of the assimilationist answer. Calls for assimilation in this country have almost always meant that some groups are expected to give something up, their language, their culture, their ways of being, in order to belong. That is not democratic resilience, that is cultural hierarchy dressed up as cohesion. What I'm describing is something else entirely. Democratic resilience does not require us to become the same. It requires us to build the capacity to live together across our differences without domination or erasure. Not assimilation into a single culture, but integration into a shared civic life. One where multiple identities are not just tolerated, but engaged, challenged, and transformed through encounter. That is a more demanding vision. It asks more of our institutions and more of us, but it is also a far more democratic one. And importantly, addressing segregation requires that we hold both problems at once. We must improve the conditions and outcomes in urban school districts that have been systematically under-resourced, and at the same time, we must expand access to diverse learning environments for students in more affluent, often suburban communities. Too often we see these as separate challenges, but they are deeply connected. Because democracy requires both equity and encounter. Equity ensures that people have a fair chance to participate. Encounter ensures that people can participate with and for one another. Without equity, democracy becomes exclusion. Without encounter, democracy becomes fragmentation. Segregated schools undermine both. So if we're serious about democratic resilience, we cannot treat school segregation as a side issue or as a relic of the past. It is a present-day policy outcome. It is a structural condition that we continue to produce through district boundaries, housing patterns, and political choices. It is something we have the power to change. The question is whether we will, because ultimately this is not just about schools, it is about the kind of society we are preparing to sustain. A democracy where people live parallel lives, rarely intersecting, struggling to understand one another, is a democracy under strain. A democracy where people learn from an early age to engage across difference with humility, curiosity, and a sense of shared fate, that is a democracy with a fighting chance. So the question is not simply whether we value integration as an educational goal, it is whether we are willing to see it for what it truly is, a democratic imperative. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. Thanks so much. Our final speaker on our panel is Mary Churchill. Professor Churchill is a sociologist, professor of the practice, associate dean, and graduate program director at Boston University's Wheelock College of Education, where she directs the Strategic Partnership and Community Engagement Office, which sets the strategic direction for the college's community and advocacy work. A strong advocate for social justice and advocacy in education, she took a public service leave in 2021 from her academic post to serve as the Chief of Policy and Planning for Mayor Kim Janey in Boston, where she managed college and university relationships, supported the launch of the mayor's Children and Youth Cabinet, and coordinated the implementation of the citywide COVID-19 mask mandate. She serves on a number of local and national boards, including the Women's Network of the Executive Council at the American Council on Education, and she has extensive experience with international governments and university partners as well. Mary, it's a pleasure to have you at Boston College. Thank you.
The shortest person on the panel. And always fun to follow an elected official, Raul, who is such an amazing public speaker. Wonderful to be here, and the student panel this morning was fantastic, really heartwarming, and got me thinking about a lot of things. So we are at a major inflection point within our society. Even as the higher ed sector is under siege, there has never been a more crucial time for the important work we are doing on our campuses. I believe that higher ed will be critical to overcoming the current challenges facing our democracy. While it may sound like I wrote those words this week, in fact, I wrote them 2 years ago in the spring of 2024. They were part of an introduction to an edited volume, The Conversation on Higher Ed, a collaboration between The Conversation US and my academic publisher, Johns Hopkins University Press. For those of you who don't know about The Conversation, it is a nonprofit independent news organization dedicated to unlocking the knowledge of experts for the public good. They do what Raul and I call public scholarship, and that is the space where the two of us spend most of our time, off campus in non-academic community spaces. In my 7 minutes here with you this morning, I want to focus on the importance of something larger, access to knowledge, which universities play a major part, but I think access to knowledge is under attack. I believe that a thriving democracy requires an educated citizenry. This morning, I will focus on 3 current troubling trends in the US: the decline in college-going rates, the increase in book bans, and the decimation of local journalism. I see these 3 as important anti-democratic trends in the United States. Unfortunately, we don't have time to discuss mis- and disinformation, which is the other side of the challenges exacerbating the knowledge deficit. According to the OECD, more than 1/4 of adults in the US have a literacy level 1 or below on a scale of 0 to 5 in the OECD survey of adult skills, the same as the OECD average of 28%. At this level, individuals can only understand very short texts with minimal distracting information. Mean literacy proficiency scores decreased across all age groups and all levels of education between 2012 and 2023. The average literacy score among older adults, 55 to 64 in the US, was higher than the OECD average, while the average literacy score among younger adults, 25 to 34, was lower than the OECD average. Immediate college-going rates in the US are also on the decline. Bachelor's or equivalent programs are the main entry point into tertiary education in most OECD countries, with an average of 78% of those starting tertiary education for the first time enrolling in such programs. In the US, the share is lower at 53%. We have a narrative in the US that not everyone needs to go to college. And most politicians who say this went to college and have sent their children to college. As a first-generation college student who started life in a trailer park in Flint, Michigan, and for whom a college education was a path out of poverty, when I hear the words, "not everyone needs to go to college," I hear that some of the most powerful people in our country believe that we need a permanent, uneducated underclass in the US. Let's move on to book bans. According to PEN America, in 2025, book censorship in the US is rampant and common and growing. Never before, and this is a quote, "never before in the life of any living American have so many books been systematically removed from school libraries across the country. Never before have so many states passed laws or regulations to facilitate the banning of books, including bans on specific titles statewide. Never before have so many politicians sought to bully school leaders into censoring according to their ideological preferences, even threatening public funding to exact compliance. and never before has the access to so many stories been stolen from so many children. The most banned book in school libraries in the US is 19 Minutes, a 2007 novel by Jodi Picoult that is about a school shooting in a small town in New Hampshire. Local journalism. According to the American Journalism Project, research shows that the loss of local news is having an insidious effect on our democracy, contributing to polarization, decrease in voting, and government accountability. As we know, local media is key to democracy. Local news is an essential lever to a healthy democracy. It helps us understand what's at stake in local elections, equips them to get involved in the political process by voting, contacting officials running for office, and reduces political polarization, and also holds public officials accountable. The State of Local News 2025 report indicates that in 2005, there were 3 newspapers for every 100,000 Americans. Today, there are 1.6. In 2005, a little more than 37 million people lived in the 1,400 counties that had 0 or only 1 newspaper. In 2025, the number has increased to more than 88 million. 1 in every 4 Americans limited access to local newspaper. Through the successful implementation of explicit and implicit barriers to knowledge, we have a less educated population in the country. The data show us that the number of Americans who believe the earth is flat and/or who believe they have seen a ghost is growing. According to Civic Science, 41% of US adults said they believe in ghosts, 30% believe that aliens have visited Earth, and 27% believe in demons. We have the ability to reverse these trends, and I believe that higher ed has a major role to play in imagining and building a more democratic future. It is up to us to make sure that the university becomes the most powerful space of future making that it can be. Democratic societies depend on curiosity, and we in higher ed have a unique responsibility and role to play in guaranteeing that curiosity can flourish.
Okay, thank you so much to all of my colleagues on the panel here. I have a million questions, and we could start to do some cross-cutting questions on a number of the thoughtful and thought-provoking arguments that were made around unity and diversity, around the relationship of education and civil society and civic engagement, around the role of government in patriotic, civic, moral education, the impact of structural inequities on what we learn and how we think about what citizenship is. But those questions are also out there on the floor as well, and given our time constraints, I want to just turn directly to questions from the floor. Let's make sure that we get a microphone out there, and we have about 15 to 20 minutes for this. Yeah. Why don't we start with Professor Quigley?
Thanks for a terrific set of remarks. Our final speaker in the next hour is someone who's over the years written in ways that are sometimes more or less persuasive about declining birth rates around the developed world. And for someone like me, very interested in schools, the one area where I'm concerned is the impact at the K-12 level and at post-secondary. And from the time of the Third Republic in France till the Racial Imbalance Act of 1965, when I was in the New York City public schools in the 1980s and 1990s, there was always a sense that you were part of a growing sector, that the schooling sector was growing. How do these questions of democratic citizenship, democratic resilience in schools play out in at least the current state where, in New England, I think of the state of Vermont, where the college sector has collapsed in some ways over the last 10 or 20 years in some troubling ways, but across both the US and other developed countries where the K-12 sector, we're seeing fewer schools, fewer opportunities for teachers, and so too college going has that impact. As enrollments go down, a number of colleges and universities are shuttering at this point.
Sure, anyone can take that.
I was actually going to make you answer it, but
Oh, no.
well, you know, I think my first thought is hi. By the way, we worked together before. I think of what Peter just said around how do we reach an older population, right? Because I think we think of a college-age population as 18 to 22, but not necessarily, right? And if we think of the average age, almost 50% of college students are in community colleges, and they're part-time, and they're older. And so I think thinking of work we do in communities and how we reach non-traditional age students, I think becomes really important for that. And I don't know if I want you to say something, Peter.
Oh, I don't know if I'm looking, perhaps our next speaker will talk about the decline, because I'm not sure if I understand the demographics. But I will pick up on the thread about adult education, yeah, because that's actually, of course, that's true regardless of what the demographic trends are. You have to worry about the older population, and the way traditionally that older people learned civic life was through either the media, which you mentioned, which is less able especially to cover local, or through associations, which are just simply smaller, and which became much smaller in the late 20th century. So that means we should think creatively about, and you can't coerce older people, you shouldn't, but also you can't coerce older people. So you have to provide attractive forms of engagement. Well, I'll just quickly say, I'm fascinated by the fact that in a few months in 1946, when the United States was running a big chunk of Germany and also had a chance to look at American higher education post-war, 2 reports were written for President Truman, one about what to do about Germans and the other about what to do about Americans, and which was the Truman Report, which you probably know very well. So the Truman Report says we're going to strengthen democracy in preparation also for the Cold War by expanding higher education. And the report about Germany said we're going to re-educate the adults, and that led actually to the construction of things like quite a robust array of state-supported nonprofits in Germany that do provide exciting opportunities. So we actually created that in Germany, and but didn't create it here. And I understand why and so on, and it would have been inappropriate to try to re-educate Americans, but there's something to be learned about the structures that were built in Germany, and actually Americans built them, which I think is kind of interesting.
Great, thank you. We had a question here in the front row, ma'am. You still have your question? Yeah, then we'll come over here.
Hi, thank you very much for this panel. I love what you do. I've always thought that if I had all the time and money in the world, I would devote myself to the cause of civic education because it's where theory and practice meet. I want to give you the opportunity to use this panel in perhaps the best way it can be used by asking each of you to briefly say what you would have each of us do practically in the next week to further the concerns that you've raised, which seem perennial within my lifetime.
Great. Who's the quickest thinker? You go first.
So there we go. Okay, thank you. Just got to turn it on, that's all. So let me say a couple things in response to both questions. One is that because of these demographic changes in part and for other reasons, we find in K-12 education, specifically in a period that feels more like austerity than it does like investment, right? And it's also important to understand that not all communities invest equally in education. In Boston, for example, about 40% of the budget of the city of Boston it goes toward education. In Brookline, it's about 60% of the budget goes toward education. These are policy decisions. And by the way, Brookline still is probably on Tuesday going to vote to put an override on the ballot to continue to fund schools at a level because of the intense costs that they're facing and also declining enrollment. And so it's important, I believe, in order to investments in education are important. I voted for the Fair Share Amendment in Massachusetts to make sure we put more money toward education, for instance. In terms of the things we can do in addressing school segregation itself, I wish there was one thing we could do this week that would get it done, but I think it is going to take a sustained commitment to supporting integration efforts within communities where that makes sense. But frankly, most of what we see in Massachusetts is between district segregation. So the more that we can support policies which create more porous district boundaries. That is where I believe personally that a student should be entitled to an education in the municipality where they live, but they shouldn't be limited to it. Meaning, and this is all across public education, I'm not talking about vouchers or anything like that, the ability for us to share educational spaces, even as we reckon with the very real, the reality of housing segregation, which is so much of what is driving the school segregation that we face, which also needs to be addressed. But these are not, unfortunately, things that can be addressed in a day or a week, but that take, I think, sustained commitment to dialogue and getting. I'll let others speak. Yeah, making sure that our school committees are moving in this direction as well.
Okay, now I'm ready. Okay, so I would say, so as you might have heard, I'm an anthropologist of religion who teaches in a marketing communication department, and that sounds random, but it's actually quite intentional. And the intentionality there is to teach marketing students, push them out of their comfort zone and teach them to think more critically about how marketing sits in the world and teach them ethics and responsibility. And something that I think everyone can do, and something that I always do with all of my students, is go out and experience something that you've never experienced before. Meet someone that you've never met before. If you've never been to a mosque, go to a mosque, visit a mosque, sit inside. If you've never been to the Christian Science Center, go visit the Christian Science Center and learn about that religion. Learn about someone else, something else, because the more we can learn about people who are different from us, the better we can be at the table, the more intentional we can be at the table and come together. I'm a firm believer that we can't continue to live in our silos. We have to be able to sit at the table together, and if we can't make that happen, then we will continue to deride our democracies.
I completely agree with everything you said, so I'm glad you said it, so I'm not going to say it. So across difference is so important. It's so uncomfortable, and the distance is growing. So I'll speak to the 3 points I raised. One, if you hear people saying not everyone goes to college, call them on it. Or not everyone needs to go to college, call them on it. Ask them if they went and if their children went, which is always a yes. 2, book bans are high in this state. Rep. John Moran is kind of leading the crusade here. He's South End, Boston rep, against book bans, but they are happening in our state. And then 3, local journalism reminds me of something Peter said about there's so much more momentum for these national movements, and most of our news now comes from national news, and we need to get much more involved in the local scene through local journalism and local movements and associations, and we've grown away from that.
Yeah, I might just mention if you went to this pilot help desk that I quickly mentioned, it's AI driven, and you typed in basically, I'm freaked out about whatever, and what do? It will nudge you first to look for an association in your jurisdiction that's working on the topic, and it can draw from tax data and other things to try to help you find that. If you can't find one, it'll nudge you to try to start something, but it will then quickly offer to draft certain kinds of documents for you that you need, because otherwise you're not going to get anywhere. So it'll offer to draft a recruitment email or message on social media, but then it'll say, do you have an agenda for your first meeting? And when you say, oh, I didn't think of that, it will say, well, can I draft an agenda for you? So I have all kinds of mixed feelings about AI. In fact, part of me spends my time very freaked out about that. But there's a set of steps there that I think we can kind of, and that's what I would suggest you asked the question probably on behalf of the whole audience, not just yourself, but that's what I would suggest. Those are the steps I would suggest we all need to use.
Terrific. We just have about 5 minutes left. Let's collect the questions that are on the floor, and then we'll let each speaker answer whichever one they'd like to. Yeah, go ahead. We'll before anybody answers, we'll take a couple of questions.
Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting, all of you. My question is about the civic centers that have been opening up across the country, especially, for example, at UNC, ASU, UT. I think in tandem with the theme of the panel being civic education, it's an interesting topic, and also thinking about engaging difference, how those institutions are working towards that goal. And I was just curious to hear, maybe specifically Professor Churchill, because you spoke on higher education, but really anyone who wants to answer, just your thoughts on those institutions and how they might have the potential to promote democratic resilience across the country.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a really interesting development. Other questions on the table before we? No? Okay, great. Why don't we let, there's no, oh yeah, Professor Beiner.
I'll do that microphone there. We heard one model in France built on the 19th century model of top-down, right? So the state controls everything, and the state is going to bring us the Republican notion, right? And everybody is part of it. And the opposite would be here in America, for example, that everything, the federal Department of Education is being dismantled in front of our eyes, right? Neither of them seems to stop the rise of challenges to democracy.
Okay, terrific. Two terrific questions. Professor Churchill, why don't you start, and then we'll go over to Peter and down the stretch. Each of you can answer bits of either or both.
So I just came from Campus Compact, which is the big association for community engagement for universities, and the civic, all of the ones you mentioned were there presenting. So it is on the rise, and there were some great keynotes, especially by the CEO of Human Rights Coalition campaign. I always want to get the C wrong. Campaign, and just phenomenal work. And so we are finding these spaces as spaces to make change happen, and really it takes faith in the ability of our youth to lead that charge, and not everyone on campus has that faith. And so I think that's the biggest challenge. Raul is very active in that area, and I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, briefly, I'll just say, yes, however, in some of these same places, we also see certain topics being restricted, certain courses not being, the courses I teach here in Massachusetts, I can't move to Florida and teach those courses. I can't move to Texas and teach those courses, right? That at the same time, we're seeing these institutions pop up that are doing something I very much support, which is making sure that we are able to hear from all different kinds of ideas, including ones that sometimes I found uncomfortable, but I want to engage with. But doing that in an environment where some people can't talk about gender or race in meaningful ways is not civic engagement, and so we have to somehow reckon with both of these things happening at the same time.
Great. Professor Levine is the head of one of the original schools and focuses on civic engagement in America, so you're well situated to answer this as well.
You know, what I wanted to say was on April 10th, all day, we have a free conference where those centers are coming together, and there's free food, and anybody who is not and no further away than Chestnut Hill could come over and find out more. There's a lot of interesting variation. There's I think it would be fair to say ideological variation, which is fine, and also is not the only way that they vary. And I think it's pretty exciting. So I'm glad that these centers are popping up, but there's a lot of rich conversation to be had, and I think debate actually. So April 10th.
And your Center for Summer Civic Engagement Institute is also important.
Well, you know what? I'll plug something different because it's more immediately accessible. There's actually an Alliance for Civics in the Academy that is also a free thing to join, and it's pretty robust. And I'm on the executive committee, and so everybody is welcome to join the Alliance for Civics in the Academy. It's really exploded.
Carol, can you bring us home? Thank you.
Can I say one thing about it? Because you could wrap it up, but I think your question about France is fascinating. Carol knows this. I just took a group of grad and undergrad students to France for 2 weeks, and we covered the French education system in comparison to the US. And the conclusion was, wouldn't it be great if we could take the best of both and create something new? So I loved your question.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. And I don't have the perfect answer, otherwise I'd probably be a politician. But I do think that, like Mary is suggesting, taking the best of both. And I also want to say that despite the challenges today, I do think that there's pockets where we can be more inspired by the kinds of education that go on. I was at a public school in Paris at one point where they were bringing in people and doing, no, I'm sorry, this was a private Catholic school, but a state-funded private Catholic school, and they were doing round sessions with a rabbi and imam and another representative coming together to teach the students how to dialogue across faiths. And so there's inspiring pockets, but I do think it's important to think about, okay, how can we make sure the centralization gives you that structure, it gives you resources, it provides hypothetically a better possibility of equitable distribution. But we see in France the pushback of that. There's a rise of independent schools and parents saying, no, I don't like that model. I want to create this other thing. And so I think allowing citizens to play, like we saw from in Scandinavia, allowing them to play with models of education that might work better is okay as long as there's some guardrails on that. And I think those guardrails are really important. And hopefully we can be inspired by our other young panelists and hope that the future of education is in the humans that we get to meet every day.
Terrific. Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists. This is a really rich field with a lot of energy in it that's happening today. So I encourage you to talk with our speakers, continue to read on this. Take a very short break. Our keynote speaker, Ross Douthat, will begin in just a few minutes. There's refreshments over here, bathroom out around this ways, but please return promptly so we can start at 11 o'clock. Thanks so much.
Were you the one who mentioned, one of you two, mentioned...
We'll just do a quick photo before everybody goes. Yeah, step over by the side.
So I trust you know about the wonderful Ada Comstock program at Smith.
Thank you. It is great to see you all here, and it is a delight to welcome our final keynote speaker of the 2026 Spring Symposium on Democratic Resilience. He is, of course, Ross Douthat, who is the renowned journalist, author, and podcaster, and it's a delight to welcome you to Boston College. Ross was born and raised in New Haven. He attended Harvard, where he earned his degree in history. After graduating, he worked for The Atlantic and the National Review before joining the New York Times in 2009 as the preeminent conservative voice on its editorial page. His pieces discuss a wide range of topics, such as the recent developments in the Republican Party, the origins of the MAGA movement, the decline of the liberal world order. In addition to his work as a journalist, Douthat is the author of 7 books, including The Deep Places, a memoir of illness and discovery, The Decadent Society, how we became the victims of our own success, and Bad Religion, how we became a nation of heretics. His most recent book, Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious, explores the rationality of religious belief in light of scientific discoveries and how religious quests should proceed amid the diversity of religious faiths. Earlier this year, he launched the podcast Interesting Times, where he has served as the host of numerous scintillating conversations with speakers from both sides of the political aisle, including Ezra Klein, Peter Thiel, Senator Chris Murphy, Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett. And in this podcast, he has attempted to map the New World Order through his interviews and conversations, and we're really, really pleased that you are here with us today. He'll be speaking on the topic of a crisis of liberalism, not a crisis of democracy. Please join me in welcoming Ross Douthat.
Thank you. There's many jokes you could make about what it means to be the preeminent conservative voice on the New York Times opinion page, but as a loyal employee, I will make none of them. I will just say thank you for that incredibly kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm very sorry that I couldn't be here for yesterday's proceedings, as Jonathan knows, because we discussed this when he offered the invitation. I've spent the last 12 days taking my family on a spring break road trip from New Haven all the way through the American South down to New Orleans, and just flew back last night. So I feel like, having spent that amount of time in a cramped minivan with 5 children, hitting up a lot of historical sites along the way, that I am basically Alexis de Tocqueville in some sense, here to tell you, talk about the riches of American democracy as experienced through rest stops and other cathedrals of our republic. But no, it is a great pleasure to be here, and this is a good way back into the sort of professional work that I do and the issues that journalists are supposed to be engaged with right now. So I thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to speak, as the title suggested, about crises of liberalism and crises of democracy, why they're not quite the same thing, why one should be perhaps relatively optimistic about the theme of this conference, about the resilience of democracy in the Western world, and particularly the United States right now. So that's the optimistic part of the conversation, which I will save, as one does, for the end. And I will begin instead by talking about why we have a crisis of liberalism, where it comes from, what its sources are, and what the political responses to it have been, the illiberal political responses, I would say. And then we'll get to the optimistic, mildly exhortative part of the discussion, and then I think we have a lot of time. So I'll try and only talk for 35 minutes or so, and we can have a nice freewheeling Q&A, questions about belief in demons, UFOs, and ghosts are especially welcome, given the mention in the last panel. So, a crisis of liberalism. I guess I could spend 30 minutes or so teasing out exactly what liberalism means and having a long discussion of John Locke, John Stuart Mill, Montesquieu, and many other figures. But rather than doing any of that, I'm just going to use liberalism as a useful signifier for the era of political consensus, post-Cold War consensus, in which I personally came of age. I went to college in the late 1990s, grew up in the 1980s, have very dim memories of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall, but basically came of age in a period when political debates were much more constrained than they are today, when there was much more of a faith in and confidence in expertise and elite capabilities in American and Western life. When I was probably a sophomore in college or a junior in college, this was 1999 to 2000, the manifestations of anything that you would call post-liberalism or illiberalism showed up in the, you could argue, the extremely small number of Americans who cast a vote for Pat Buchanan in the 2000 presidential election, maybe a decisive share of Americans, depending on how you interpret some of the butterfly ballot debates of the Florida election, but certainly not a share of Americans who represented a meaningful political constituency. If you were looking for alternatives to liberalism, or at least alternatives to what gets called neoliberalism on the left, you could look at the World Trade Organization protests, the Battle of Seattle in the late 1990s, some other manifestations, but really these two felt essentially marginal from the perspective of my college-going years. And there was a sense basically that the politics that were shared in common by figures as different in some ways as Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Tony Blair were they set the parameters in which political debates were going to be conducted, in which certainly I, as a young person, expected them to be conducted. A basic confidence in liberal norms and institutions, in the benefits, economic and political, of globalization, of free speech, of open societies, a strong hostility to racism and anti-Semitism. The 1990s were kind of the peak of anti-Semitism as a profound force in American life, the era of Schindler's List and Elie Wiesel and other figures as figures looming over the culture as a whole. And it was an era in which, I took political philosophy classes, right? And you would read pre-modern political philosophers, you would read the critics of liberalism from the 19th and 20th century, and you could have lively debates about them, sometimes in the classroom, sometimes if you were a real nerd and were drinking late into the night and wanted to argue about where you would have stood if you were transported back in time to the 18th century or even the early 20th century. But the basic understanding was that those were academic debates that were not profoundly relevant to the politics of the early 21st century. And politics in the early 21st century was going to be conducted, again, within lines circumscribed by Bush and Gore, maybe later Mitt Romney and Barack Obama. And it was going to be conducted within those lines, and this is crucial, I think, to understanding what has happened since, because there was a broad understanding that that kind of liberal, free market, democratic politics just worked in a way that alternatives from fascism to communism to, even more moderate forms of illiberalism just didn't work at all. And it was not, it was not merely philosophically or morally wrong to imagine other forms of politics intruding. It was just naive and unrealistic that, between them, the Tony Blair and Alan Greenspan, right? If you put a center-left managerialism together with a libertarian-inflected neoliberal managerialism, you could solve basically any problem that was likely to come along. In fact, I didn't even take, this is an incredibly embarrassing admission in an academic setting, I didn't even take an economics class in college because in part it was like a 2-semester thing and I only wanted to take 1 semester, you're in college, right? But also it just seemed like a pretty boring zone, honestly. Late 1990s, things were pretty much figured out. and I ended up taking a linguistics class instead to fulfill that particular requirement, which was really important because my future wife took the same class. So it all worked out for me personally. For Western civilization, maybe less so. So what has happened since, right? How have we gone in 25 years from that era of liberal consensus to an era where, at the very least, the liberal order is under severe strain, and where there is just an incredible range of ideologies and forces contending for influence and power relative to the world of my youth? Well, I think there's several stories you can tell about that, but I think a really useful place, especially for people who attend elite universities or work for elite newspapers or attached in some way to the leadership of American society, is to start with elite failure. I don't think there should be anything surprising about a political consensus entering into crisis if you live through a period of time in which, in various ways, in foreign policy, in economic policy, in responses to the sudden appearance of a global pandemic, you can run through the lists, there is a sense that the leadership class of the Western world has not succeeded in anything like the way the leadership class of the Western world was perceived to have succeeded in managing the end of the Cold War and the transition from the 1980s into the digital age. So this record of failure obviously starts, in certain ways it starts with 9/11 itself, a kind of basic intelligence failure, in certain ways the most fundamental kind of elite failure, a failure to keep the United States safe from foreign adversaries. It extends through the entirety of the war on terror, encompassing both the really acute failures associated with the invasion and occupation of Iraq, which were mostly failures associated with the political right and neoconservatism, though they also implicated people in the political center and center-left who had supported the war as well. And then the slower bleed, if you'll forgive that, sort of non-metaphorical metaphor, of the war in Afghanistan, where the center-left elites sort of cast it as the good war, took more responsibility for it. It was managed and run by Barack Obama throughout his presidency. We stayed in Afghanistan for an incredibly long period of time and ended up just effectively losing. So you could sort of throw in sort of subcategories in there, the Obama-era intervention in Libya and other things, but I think Iraq and Afghanistan broadly can just stand in for foreign policy failure, again, in stark contrast with the perceived foreign policy successes of the end of the Cold War. Then you have failures in political economy that lead to the global financial crisis and the Great Recession in 2007, 2008, 2009, and then extend both in the United States, I think especially in Western Europe, through the failed or insufficient policy responses to that crisis. Again, this is, I think, more acute in the Eurozone than in the United States, but is notable in both zones, that you have elite commitments to certain kinds of visions of political economy, a vision, if you wanted to critique it from the left, you would call it a vision of austerity, and a fixation on balanced budgets. If you wanted to critique it on the right, especially in the case of Europe, you would say it's a commitment to a vision of the Eurozone as an economic unity that doesn't have political unity in a way that has proved fundamentally unworkable for about 5 years after the Great Recession. But combine those different failures and you get a sense that elites didn't know what they were doing when it came to economic policy. Then, again, sort of skipping over sub-failures of various kinds, you could say the failure of the Western world's policy toward China, where, the peak of the consensus that I just described was the integration of China into the global economy, into the then American-led world economic order, whatever you want to call it now, right? Which was, again, supported firmly by politicians of both parties, Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich joining hands in its support, and the perception was basically that this was going to be good economically for the West and good politically for the Chinese, that there was sort of an inevitable, sort of a fruitful interaction between globalization, trade liberalization, and political liberalization, and ultimately democratization. I think the negative effects of the integration with China on the West can be overstated. In broad terms, the free trade consensus was correct that overall integration with China made the United States richer than it otherwise would have been, but there were incredibly important concentrated negative impacts that went beyond, I think, what was anticipated and were not easily managed by technocratic policy that yielded a large number of regions and areas in the West that felt abandoned, betrayed, left behind in ways that contributed pretty inexorably to the rise of populism. And then at the same time, you have the total failure of the optimistic account of what the late 1990s consensus would mean for liberalization and democracy in China. And so basically by the late 2010s, you have a scenario where people in the West can look around and say, well, integration with China made us marginally richer, impoverished and deindustrialized certain key areas of our economy, and by the way, raised up a authoritarian/totalitarian rival to the United States on a scale that hadn't existed since the end of the Cold War. Not much of a success. Then the COVID era. I don't want to relitigate every public health controversy of the COVID era. I would just say, in a way that maybe could find a certain degree of bipartisan agreement, that the response to COVID by public health authorities and political leaders in both the US and Europe ended up falling into a kind of sour spot where it was sufficiently draconian, or perceived as sufficiently draconian, as to inspire all manner of disappointment, betrayal, rebellions, feelings of oppression, without being at all successful in actually suppressing the disease. So the overhang of COVID, again, in our politics is one more set of failures where elites made a certain set of claims about their own authorities, about their own authority and competency, and did not ultimately deliver. Now, 25 years is a long time. I'm oversimplifying a bit by neglecting, there were things that did go well in various ways. You could argue that the monetary policy response to the Great Recession was more successful than the monetary response to the Great Depression. There were elements of the economic response to COVID that I think were actually quite successful. And you can make a longer list beyond that. But I think people in the United States and Europe could be, have a very understandable sense of skepticism, disappointment, and sometimes betrayal around really large-scale endeavors that elites, again, of both the center-right and center-left were invested in over the last 25 years, that makes it quite natural to pass that makes it quite natural that we have passed from an era of intense and potent consensus to an era of fracture, fragmentation, and polarization. I think elite failure alone suffices to explain a large amount of the situation we find ourselves in. But then a couple other factors matter as well. Just to extend from the Chinese example a bit, there was a general confidence, not confined to our policy towards Beijing in the late 1990s, that the wave of liberalization and democratization that happened sort of in tandem in the 1980s and 1990s and extended across Eastern Europe and Latin America could be extended naturally across the Middle East, Africa, and parts of Asia as well. And that did not happen. Various sort of political movements from the kind of neoconservative vision of democratizing the Middle East by force of arms to the optimism around the Arab Spring all sort of came to naught. And you ended up by the early 2020s with a situation in which outside of the West, it made sense to talk about illiberal resilience. And that meant two distinct but overlapping things. On the one hand, a fundamental resilience of completely illiberal authoritarian regimes, and like China, like some of the Gulf monarchies. And then at the same time, even in countries with strong democratic traditions, a form of politics, populist and nationalist, that was seen by Westerners as much more illiberal than they would have hoped, right? With, you know, Narendra Modi's government in India as a prominent example, Erdogan's government in Turkey. You can multiply examples, right? So the narrative of the world over the last 25 years basically demonstrated certain limits to a kind of, you know, progressive, you know, steady liberalizing vision of what 21st century history was going to be. Then finally, you have a kind of personal, sociological, and spiritual crisis that I think has taken hold pretty strongly in the Western world over that same period. And everything interacts with everything else. This is connected, I think, to the sense of elite failure. It's connected to political and economic failures. It's connected to the experience of living through a pandemic. But basically, there's a way in which you could say that under digital conditions, some of the old critiques, usually from the right, but sometimes from the left as well, of what liberalism gets wrong, have taken on sort of new force and found new vindication, right? So one of the major lines of critique against liberalism, going all the way back to the French Revolution, Joseph de Maistre, and continuing on, you know, through the 20th century, has been, well, you know, it yields too much individualism, too much atomization, a loss of religious faith, a loss of human confidence, a loss of solidarity and community. And again, this critique can often be overdrawn, and has especially been overdrawn in the United States itself. I mentioned Alexis de Tocqueville already. All of de Tocqueville's work indicates in certain ways the limits of that anti-liberal critique. Tocqueville goes around the US and says, hey, looks like under liberal conditions, actually, community, family, religion, they all seem to be flourishing, right? What do you make of that, Joseph de Maistre? He didn't say that, I'm saying that. So that, it has been a reality in the United States especially, that under liberal conditions, human culture has been able to consistently generate the patterns and behaviors that skeptics of liberalism worried would diminish or disappear. However, I think you could argue pretty reasonably that the last 20 or 25 years, and you know, if you follow Robert Putnam, you can go back further and say that this starts in the 60s and 70s, but I think the internet and digital life is a huge accelerant, basically makes liberal culture look a bit more like what reactionary and sometimes Marxist critics say it would be, right? So you have a really strong substitution of digital simulations of community for the real thing. You have a real acceleration of the Putnam phenomenon of people falling away from civic engagement, communal engagement. People on the prior panel spoke about this a little bit. It's clearly a big reality of early 21st century life. And again, it's a reality that extends beyond just sort of the political sphere and sort of engagement in local politics or reading local journalism. It extends all the way to things like teenagers hanging out in the mall, things that you wouldn't think of as necessarily sort of political or spiritual phenomena of great note, but which turn out to be under conditions where suddenly teenagers are alone in their rooms talking to their friends on digital devices, sources of increasing alienation, dismay, and even despair. And in certain ways, you know, sort of the internet kind of falls on, if I'm putting on my own reactionary hat a little bit, falls onto a liberal culture that it itself sort of eaten away at certain pre-liberal forms and institutions, right? Religion in the United States, family in the United States, community life in the United States in the late 1990s and early 2000s was weakened in various ways. Enter the internet and everything gets much, much weaker still. And in that environment, again, it is not surprising that people who are living their lives online, who have experienced eras of sort of elite failure and have good reasons to look askance at what sort of figures in authority are telling them, start looking for weirder and stranger ideas, novel forms of community, some of which have absolutely nothing to do with politics, right? But some of which see in, non-liberal, pre-liberal, post-liberal, anti-liberal, whatever you want to call it, right? See in those forms of politics something that is conspicuously lacking in the society that they themselves as young people are experiencing. And, some of this is, ends up representing kind of higher aspirations, and some of it ends up representing lower and darker aspirations. As a Catholic myself, I would say, the impulse towards greater, some kind of trad turn, right, in youthful Catholic life represents people looking around at the religious landscape and saying, I need something more intense, more devotional, something that pulls me into a more profound connection with God. And then I would say the impulse towards, sort of ethnic identity politics, racism, and anti-Semitism, which are incredibly powerful forces in internet culture now, represents the darker impulse. But in a way that's too neat a separation. These things are often intertwined. Sometimes they're intertwined in the same people, right? People are looking for something higher, but also just sort of looking for a sense of identity, looking for someone to blame, looking for something that the larger institutions of society are not providing, looking for something that digital culture itself seems to be profoundly dissolving. So that's an account of roughly how we got here. Elite failure, illiberal resilience, and a kind of technologically mediated cultural and spiritual crisis falling most profoundly on young people. And I won't take a long detour into the declining birth rate question. I will just say that that is sort of the most objective manifestation of certain forms of spiritual malaise and a loss of confidence in the future, and the failure of social institutions to do basic things like figuring out how men and women can get along with each other, have sex with each other, live in community with each other, be married to each other, raise kids together, right? And that's not a problem, by the way, that is unique to the liberal West. If you look at the Chinese birth rate right now, you would not say, the solution to our birth rate problem, comrades, is to, listen to Mao Zedong thought or something. No, this is the birth rate crisis is it's a more universal problem than that. But it is, in the West, a kind of case study in problems that liberal institutions don't know how to solve. I think that's a big part of where we are right now. We have a lot of problems that liberal institutions don't know how to solve. So then what has been the political response? Well, one political response, the kind that gets, I would say, roughly 93.7% of the attention from academics concerned about the crisis of liberalism, is the rise of populism. And the rise of populism is, I would say, essentially a kind of personalist illiberalism, a vision of the current crisis that looks for incredibly strong figures who can act in politics, cut through the failures of bureaucracy and the sclerosis of legislatures, and just, get things done, make things better, bring the jobs back, keep the immigrants out, restore religion in America, restore Christian confidence in Western Europe, and so on. And Donald Trump himself is the extreme expression of this kind of personalist tendency, but you see it wherever there is populism, there is this kind of personalism. There's always some leader or figure, or almost always. Maybe the alternative for Deutschland in Germany is a modest exception, but Germany is exceptional in so many different ways. But whether it is, Meloni in Italy, or the Le Pen family in France, or Farage in the UK, or then, again, beyond the West, the Erdogans and Modis and so on, there is always a desire for the strong leader who can solve the insolvable problems. And put history back on whatever track it was supposed to be on 25 or 50 years ago. And again, this tendency is, there's a range, you know, all things fall on continuums, right? So there's a range between liberal consensus and sort of illiberal personalism. And, you know, you would say that like Barack Obama's 2008 campaign, for instance, was a little more Trumpian in some ways than Bill Clinton's 1996 campaign, right? Like sort of a sort of identification with an incredibly charismatic leader is not something that just shows up on the populist extreme. And it, you know, it shows up in various forms in various places. But broadly speaking, if you're talking about an illiberal challenge to the liberal consensus from the right, that is what you are talking about. And it tends to be associated with executive overreach, greater corruption, now with a military escalation in the Middle East with uncertain consequences. But generally, that is the challenge from the right. There's also a challenge from the center-left, which gets somewhat less attention, I would say, in the academic literature on this subject. And it gets less of that attention in part because academics, to generalize a bit, tend to be on the center-left themselves. It also gets less attention, though, because it is less flagrant and flamboyant and personalized. You don't have, you know, sort of distinctive figures who embody this tendency in quite the way that Donald Trump clearly embodies populism. But the tendency instead is made manifest through bureaucracy, through the apparatus, the existing apparatuses of the state, but also NGOs and institutions, sort of paragovernmental institutions across the Western world, courts, other entities where, again, personal charisma matters less. But what is the tendency? The tendency basically is a tendency that says it's really important to save liberalism and we need to be kind of illiberal in order to save it, right? And an extreme example of this tendency would be the pattern in the United Kingdom of arresting large numbers of people and putting them in jail for their social media posts. Something that if Donald Trump or Stephen Miller were doing it in the United States would inspire the faculty of most American universities to take to the streets in protests. But because it happens under Keir Starmer's government, who could be afraid of Keir Starmer? No one could imagine Keir Starmer as a dictator or anything like that. Nonetheless, it is a form of effective authoritarianism in the pursuit of saving the liberal order. And I think you can multiply examples of this pattern. I think it sort of, in the United States, it reached a particular peak under COVID conditions, where the quest to suppress things that public health authorities deemed misinformation, some of which were misinformation, some of which were probably not misinformation, led to an attempt to sort of build a collaborative relationship between governmental entities, public health entities, and internet companies that basically would kind of manage discourse in a way that felt to everybody, basically to the political right of Mitt Romney, like the tacit expression, the tacit suppression of free speech. This is, I think, a really strong temptation felt by, again, people who consider themselves defenders of the liberal order, a belief that, you know, that in order to defend the liberal order, in order to defend pluralism, in order to manage the complexities of a diverse society, you know, maybe the First Amendment just doesn't quite work that well anymore, or maybe the First Amendment is fine, but we can come up with these kind of different ways of collaboration between the government and private entities, where the government isn't formally suppressing speech or managing speech, but in practice, that's what happens. And related to this, I think, is a impulse, a desire that has been there for a long time on the center-left to effectively remove certain issues from political debate. To say that, you know, in effect, a debate on subject X is closed. We had the debate, it's over, the good guys won, and now we're not going to debate that anymore. And if you want to debate that anymore, you are now outside of liberalism. You are yourself illiberal, right? And so it takes the way that America approached segregation and Jim Crow and racism as a normative model for dealing with debates over same-sex marriage, over immigration, ideally over transgender rights. And again, this is not always formally expressed, but I think it is palpably present throughout liberal, left of center, excuse me, you mix up your liberal terms when you're talking in this way, but it's been palpably present throughout left of center discourse in the last 10 years, and it exists in a kind of dynamic relationship with populism, where there is a push from the left of center to say, well, we're not, immigration policy in Europe is not going to be set by national majorities, it's going to be set by technocratic elites who know best. Well, guess what? Voters who are post-immigration don't like that very much and start voting for populist parties instead of center-right parties, and then the center-left says, oh, this is terrifying, they're voting for populist parties, we need to double down on technocratic control of immigration lest the populists win, and it's a very sort of frustrating but sort of inevitable escalation of a polarized dynamic. So that's, I could go on, but I think that's sort of a shorthand description of what I see as the illiberal temptation of the center-left, the desire to remove certain issues from political debate and to use sort of managerial systems, not charismatic personalities, to sort of keep a lid on the extremes of political debate and speech. So these are sort of the forces locked in contestation in our politics right now. Again, both in the United States and Western Europe. But now let's say something, it's a pessimistic account, so let's say something optimistic. What is something that these forces actually have in common? I would say that they have in common a basic commitment to the will of the people expressed through elections, through the ballot box, and also through public opinion polls, honestly, and other sort of secondary manifestations as the only core form of legitimacy in politics. Now, this is a controversial statement in some ways, and obviously there's a lot of people who think that populism and Trumpism, because of January 6th and other debacles, actually desires to, overturn the will of the people and establish an anti-democratic authoritarian regime. I think that that is the wrong way of understanding certainly how populism conceives of itself. Populism very explicitly conceives of itself as a small d democratic movement in a kind of rebellion against arrogant technocratic elites. And all of the people, I don't want to say all, 99% of the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th were fundamentally convinced that they were doing so in the name of the true will of the people, the true American democracy that had been manipulated and suppressed by elite machinations over the course of the 2020 campaign. Now, you could say, well, there's no fundamental difference between a sort of notionally pro-democratic populism that wants to overturn elections and a fully anti-democratic populism that wants to install a dictator. I think that's wrong. I think that we have lived through extended periods in Western history and obviously in all of human history when large factions in politics simply didn't want democracy. They didn't believe that the will of the people was a primary source or a fundamental source of legitimacy. When democracies were established, they were fragile and easy to overthrow precisely because large numbers of elites, this is in part the story of Weimar Germany, just had no basic commitment to the idea that democracy was the fundamental legitimating force. I don't think America is like that at all. I think it is almost impossible to find serious people engaged in American politics. I'm not talking about, someone on the internet calling for a Protestant Franco or something, I don't know. But people who are actually engaged in politics, who actually hold political power, who are committed to a non-democratic vision of politics. You have really hot arguments about how elections are run, who should be allowed to vote, what kind of ID people should have to show in order to vote. but the fundamental commitment to small d democracy is nonetheless the basic consensus underlying those incredibly hot debates. And it is, in fact, relatively hard for me to see, under the current dispensation, how it would go away. And I say this in part just because I've lived through, the last 6 to 8 years in American politics, where repeatedly a kind of small d democratic will of the people has asserted itself over and against powerful elite formations, and so far has generally done so successfully. Not in a way that has, yielded happiness and sweetness and light in American politics, but in a way that should give us a certain degree of confidence that that sort of core commitment to democracy and the power of public opinion are still primary and fundamental forces in American life. And this pattern starts after 2020, when if you are on the political right or you spent any amount of time hanging out on the political right, there was a powerful sense after 2020 that essentially American democracy was going to be rigged against the right for a generation to come. That you had this profound alignment, again, that had been manifest under COVID between, democratic lawmakers, the NGO industrial complex, and the Silicon Valley elite who controlled, the entirety of social media and everything else, and they were just going to use censorship and, everything else to just kind of manage American democracy and make it impossible for populist Republicans, at the very least, to ever win again. And that Trump had been this kind of aberration, and the elite had joined forces against Trump, had defeated him in 2020, and would make sure that populism would never rise again. This was not obviously the view of, most of the political science academy, but this was an incredibly powerful perspective among my fellow conservatives in 2021 or so. And what happened, and I should say, a powerful idea among liberal academics and liberal journalists at the same period, was that January 6th was the doorway into a world where the Republican Party might become almost like Hezbollah, right? That it would refuse to accept all elections. There would be political violence all the time. Republicans would never cooperate with Democrats again, and so on. And in fact, neither of those two stories came to pass at all. January 6th was basically a one-off. There was no organized right-wing violence around elections at any point, notwithstanding the professed right-wing view that Joe Biden was an illegitimate president. Republicans in the Senate especially cooperated with Joe Biden, cut deals with Joe Biden. Biden was a more successful legislator in terms of than Barack Obama had been in some ways. He was not at all successful in other ways, but in terms of just like getting some Senate Republicans to vote for his bills, he was relatively successful. And then over the same period, that kind of perceived totalizing left-wing control of American politics just totally broke up and collapsed as soon as Biden himself became unpopular. And in fact, far from imposing some kind of long-term left-wing dominance on American life, the sort of unified anti-Trump political elite was totally unable to prevent him from returning to power and even winning a majority of the popular vote. So from a right-wing perspective, that speaks to the resilience of the demos of public opinion as a fundamental force in American life over and against elite attempts to manipulate, suppress, and control it. Now think about it from a left-wing perspective. Donald Trump is elected president and spends the first 6 to 8 months of his presidency sort of consolidating executive power on a scale I think it's reasonable to say we haven't seen since FDR, maybe Lyndon Johnson, you could argue, but certainly not since the early part of the 21st century. And this then feeds into the pre-existing liberal and left-wing fears that Trump is destined to become a dictator, that this is it. 2024 was the last fair and free election, and so on. What has happened since then? Well, what has happened since then is that Trump pursued a succession of policies that became extremely politically unpopular. As they became politically unpopular, his capacity to actually push forward substantial policy change in Washington, D.C. became more and more constrained. To take just one example, the first 4 months of the administration, he had, Elon Musk running around proposing all manner of cuts to all manner of programs. And in the last 4 months, we've watched the Republican-controlled Senate and House basically gently and subtly, but in real ways, roll back almost all of those cuts and basically say, we're not doing that, and we're not doing that, and we're not doing that, notwithstanding the Trump administration's continued support for those cuts. Or to take another example, the example of Minneapolis, the Trump administration's policy in Minneapolis was rolled back because the public turned against it. You can imagine a world where Trump ignored public opinion and just kept escalating. Doesn't matter what the polls say, doesn't matter what the country thinks. We are occupying Minneapolis until every last illegal alien is deported. But no, that's not what happened. In fact, a pretty normal cycle of executive overreach, sort of chaos, debacle, disaster, political backlash, and executive retreat ensued. And I think you can multiply examples of all of that across this administration, including arenas that touch on the university. The Trump administration, heading into the midterms, is in a position that is normal for an administration that has done a lot of unpopular things and has mostly sought to consolidate executive power and not pass major legislation. It is unpopular. It is facing some version of political defeat. The scale of the political defeat may be determined by events ongoing in the Middle East, but basically public opinion and small d democratic impulses and norms have asserted themselves much more strongly, in fact, than elite institutions. And I agree with the panelist earlier who mentioned that, in terms of sort of organized institutional capital R resistance to Trump, those forces have been weaker in his second term. In part, why were they weaker? Well, in part because he won a majority of the popular vote this time around, right? Again, a democratic mandate yields more political power, but the fact that those higher level institutional forces have been weaker has not prevented public opinion itself from providing a powerful check on Trumpian overreach. Now, all of this could change in 6 months, and you can look back on these comments and describe them as naive, and when we're all imprisoned on Baffin Island together, I will agree with you. But pending that eventuality, I think the story of both the kind of high tide of liberal power early in the Biden presidency and the high tide of Trumpian power in the first 6 months of his administration have followed patterns that reaffirm the fundamental potency of democracy and public opinion in American life, and should make you skeptical of all narratives in which an illiberal culture, which we increasingly live in, yields to sort of authoritarian, anti-democratic politics, which I don't think that we have right now. But what does one make of all of this? Gone on longer than I intended, so I'll just say this as an ender, and then we can have a discussion. I think that there are all kinds of sort of small-scale, localist, personal, and institutional ways that we should think about the social and cultural crisis that we're in, and that we should think about political engagement overall right now. But I started this talk focusing on elite failure, so I just want to say one word about elite success. Like, there is a kind of elite-driven solution to the crisis of liberalism, and it's consonant with the belief that the United States remains a democracy in which public opinion is a decisive shaping force. And that elite-driven solution is for a political coalition or group of leaders or president to take power and first govern more effectively than presidents have done over the past 20 or 25 years. Easier said than done, but I think not impossible. But related to it is to govern in a way that takes broad-scale public opinion seriously as the primary thing that a successful president is supposed to serve. And one of the places in which the kind of polarization I've described between populism and a kind of anxious, we got to destroy liberalism in order to save it, center-left politics, one of the places where that has gotten us is a world where coalitions take power and they're like, okay, it's an emergency. And the first thing we do in an emergency is we pass everything that we desperately need to pass, no matter how popular it is, because this is an emergency, it's the only chance we'll get. And two, we also need to crush our political enemies. If you don't prosecute Donald Trump, American democracy is over. If you don't crush the deep state, American democracy is over. Those moves then become very unpopular, and the other side is elected, and the cycle continues. The way to break that pattern is for someone to win 51% of the vote, or 53% of the vote even. Imagine that. And to go into power and say, I'm going to govern as if my primary audience is the 5% of the electorate that voted for the other party 10 years ago and now voted for me. Not the only thing. Obviously, you have to serve your own party and your own coalition, but spending more time governing the country in service to the shrunken but still real constituency of conflicted, cross-pressured swing voters would go a long way, I think, towards restoring broad public confidence in the capacity of an elite in a liberal society to govern that society, and would go a long way towards effectively doubling down on the part of the American Republic that is resilient, which is the country, the culture's fundamental commitment to the idea that the way you get legitimacy is to persuade more than half of the country to vote for you and to support you. And so that, I think that that is difficult. I don't think it's impossible. And I think that it is the goal that elite political actors should set themselves towards, to save liberalism, serve democracy a little better than you have been of late. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was really a tour de force. I want to open up the room to questions. I'll just start with two of my own. In your discussion of elite failure and the loss of the liberal consensus, it made me think a little bit about the 1970s. Yeah. So there was in foreign policy, there was the best and the brightest, and the huge disappointments about the Vietnam War. In domestic politics, there was, of course, Watergate and a loss of confidence in elected officials. There was the Church Commission that showed the extent of the CIA involvement in domestic politics. There was stagflation and the failed policies of the oil crisis. There was the revelation that the Great Society of LBJ had yielded segregation and inequality. So did we, in fact, recover from that initial set of failures of the liberal consensus? If so, how? And therefore, how peculiar have the last 25 years been in your analysis?
So you want me to say if neoliberalism worked or not in 2 minutes or less? Yes, I think that we did, to a substantial degree, recover from the crises of the 1970s. I think the ways in which we recovered partially reflected kind of cultural trends that were beyond sort of the control of particular political parties or factions. Basically, if you look at the late 1960s and 1970s in cultural terms, what you see is a huge youth bulge in the population interacting with a period of radical personal liberation that yielded a lot of personal liberation and also a lot of real social chaos. And there was a kind of, the late novelist and journalist Tom Wolfe called it a great relearning, but a kind of stabilization, right? So, if you look at divorce rates, they go way up in the 1960s and early 70s, and then people sort of find their way to a new model of marriage, and divorce rates go down somewhat subsequently. Crime policy, is an incredibly fraught issue, but is a failure in the 1980s, a failure in the late 1970s, and becomes more successful in the 1990s, and crime rates go down and cities become livable again and so on. So that's less sociology than policy. But yeah, I think you have that pattern, and then you have a pattern in political economy where basically there's a mixture of not sort of hard libertarian, but a kind of deregulatory approach to economic matters and fiscal matters that works okay. It's not perfect, it has a lot of problems, but it's better than where the kind of Keynesian welfare state had ended up in the 1970s, and it carries us through into the early 21st century, and then under various pressures it starts to come apart. The problem, I gave this long, rambling talk and didn't even use the words artificial intelligence at any point. I think that the challenge for thinking about, like, okay, the neoliberal order is over, what comes next, is that what is actually probably coming next is some kind of economic revolution driven by new technology, that it's really hard to figure out what the right policy response is, because we don't actually know how far that technological revolution is going to go. So where I ended was saying, well, it's actually easier than people think, maybe, for a successful politician or statesman to stabilize things, like just act a little less crazy, act like the median voter really matters. But in terms of policy making, when I look ahead to the next 5 to 10 years, I feel like I'm staring into fog to a degree that has never been true in my own professional life, where it's just like we don't, the policy response to AI may just dominate the 2028 election, for instance, but we don't know what the effects of AI are yet, so we don't know what the policy response is going to be. But that's sort of, if there's an answer to, what's the equivalent of the sort of, post-1970s Great Moderation economic consensus, it's going to have something to do with artificial intelligence, and we just don't know what that's going to look like.
Thank you. So I find you to be encouragingly bullish on American democracy and the current state of it. There was a conference held on the rule of law and the common good in Catholic social thought, this very podium, just a week ago. And there was more than one legal scholar who argued that the rule of law is under attack by our own government, citing examples like the unprecedented defiance of hundreds of court orders in number of cases, but you could, of course, pick other instances like the pardoning of those who attacked law enforcement on January 6th. So what level of defiance or investigation of electoral fraud would it take for you to consider the U.S. to be even nearing a constitutional crisis? I take it that you have sort of infinite confidence in the checks and balances of our system.
No, I wouldn't say I have infinite confidence in anything, except, I would say that you get a constitutional crisis when the president defies the Supreme Court. There are other ways to get a constitutional crisis, but when you're talking about issues of the rule of law as it works in our system, that's what a constitutional crisis means. I think the Trump administration is profoundly corrupt in various ways and has indeed sort of, conducted some kind of assault on the rule of law in various ways. I don't think that is incompatible with a society being a democracy. And I think if you look back, we talked a lot about the FCC, for instance, when the FCC was going after Jimmy Kimmel or going after ABC and so on. It's worth looking back on how Franklin Delano Roosevelt used the FCC in the 1930s and early 1940s as a much more explicit weapon against his political enemies. That was really bad. It was worse than anything Trump has done in that particular area. It doesn't mean that the United States ceased to be a democracy in the 1930s or early 40s. It just meant that, we had a president who was abusing his power in one particular way. And I think that's an important distinction to make. Like, you should be able to say, the president is abusing his power and we need to find a way to contain him, without saying, and we live in a tyrannical society and democracy is dead. And the only way you get to an actual tyrannical society in this particular zone is for a president to successively defy the Supreme Court on major issues and win and render their veto a dead letter, and leave himself and his appointed attorney general as, the only source of legal authority. And I think so far that not only has that not happened, but the Supreme Court has dealt this president a succession of meaningful meaningful policy setbacks in recent days that are themselves, I would say, connected to the patterns of public opinion and sort of public sentiment that I was referencing, right? The Supreme Court is obviously a political entity too. And how, John Roberts decides exactly how he's going to approach cases, no matter what he tells you, is connected to where public opinion is connected to that sort of underlying temperature taking of the American public. But that is itself part of what democratic resilience means, right? If the Supreme Court is saying, okay, the president's getting out of hand and it's time to curb him a bit, and one way you can see that he's getting out of hand is that he's doing really unpopular things, that is that is part of what a democratic culture looks like. So yeah, I would not say I have infinite faith in the checks and balances of our system. I do right now think the Supreme Court has a strong position vis-a-vis Trump. It has that strong position not just for sort of abstract constitutional reasons, but because he has done unpopular things and lost some of his own political power in the process.
And in terms of the dangers of what you referred to, sort of liberal tyranny and the hindsight of how COVID-19 was handled.
I didn't say tyranny. I just said, but go on.
Do you think that there has been some learning from this process? Do you think that another pandemic would go down differently in terms of this information environment and the policy choices?
I think the information environment has changed in ways that make the particular things that were done during COVID very hard to imagine, right? That there was this weird moment of kind of social media consolidation where it was possible to say, okay, if we just have like 2 or 3 social media companies, sort of disfavoring certain content, we can affect discourse. And I think the landscape looks much more fragmented now. Obviously, Musk purchasing Twitter is part of that story, but it's not the only part of that story. I think the internet sort of tends towards consolidation at certain moments and tends towards fragmentation at others, and we're back to a kind of fragmentation moment. So I just think there wouldn't be sort of the opportunities. I think that public health authorities, you couldn't do, Donald Trump and the Republican Party went along with a bunch of public health mitigation measures in the first 6 months of the pandemic that in a similar situation today's Republican Party wouldn't go along with. Now, if we got a worse pandemic, that could be very bad, right? But that would be different too. There's sort of now a kind of default antipathy towards public health authority among populists that was much weaker before COVID came along. So I don't know what lessons have been learned. I would just say the landscape has shifted and the next crisis will be terrible in some totally different new way.
Thank you. So we have about 10-15 minutes for questions. So please, I think we have a microphone that we can circulate. Yes. So please start on the left here with Professor Frank Garcia.
Thank you very much for that very balanced and enlightening and challenging presentation. I wanted to focus for a moment on when you talk about public opinion, what that means. Because a couple of years ago, the Clough Center had a series on the arts and the culture of democracy. And one of the organizing intuitions of that was that democracy is more than just opening your mouth. That there may be some presuppositions about a culture that teaches people discourse and discernment, that shows them what information looks like versus opinion, that creates an environment in which you can have a conversation like a kind of deliberation, and that's what makes public opinion so valuable, is that it means this is really what we think we should do. And my anxiety with what you're saying is that if there's anything to that, and then that in this epistemic fragmentation and AI environment that you've been talking about, that really what public opinion now means is, can you manipulate enough people to think what you want them to think? And then the question becomes not just who's doing that manipulation, and maybe that's where the real drivers are, but also have we lost, or are we jeopardizing a fundamental presupposition of democracy, is that public opinion means something like that, and that we've lost the conditions that make that possible?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say that I share the concern about what democratic politics looks like under current epistemic conditions. I think I think there's a simplification of that in liberal discourse where it's like, well, if people just deliberated a little bit more seriously, they would realize that liberals were right? Like that is an intuition that undergirds some of that discourse. But look, yeah, I think it is, we are, for instance, clearly moving from a really powerful print culture to a much more oral culture, right? I see this just myself since I started doing a podcast, a video podcast, right? And I just get a completely different kind of engagement from that than I get from my columns. And in that, I realized that like the engagement I was getting from my written columns had diminished somewhat over the years I'd been at the New York Times. That's a shift. I have to have a career, so I'm leaning into the shift to some degree, but I don't necessarily think it's good for civic life and democratic culture. Like I think there is some kind of relationship between literacy, print culture, and democracy that's been historically important, and I would worry about its diminution. And yeah, I could sort of multiply examples where I'd be in agreement with those concerns. At the same time, I think it is important to see two things. The first is that I think fears of like incredibly successful mass manipulation, at least so far, have seemed to me to be pretty overblown. Donald Trump, there are people, I actually saw a debate on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, right? Jon Stewart, Elon Musk called Jon Stewart a master of manipulation. Anyway, the upshot of this was something like Jon Stewart was calling Elon Musk a master of manipulation. I follow Elon Musk on social media. Elon Musk is not a master of manipulation. If you already agree with Elon Musk, then his tweets are totally convincing and, in every single way, but no person entering politics with a kind of, centrist to liberal mentality would be persuaded to become right-wing by reading Elon's tweets, right? He's just not, that's not what he's doing. He's not doing manipulation. Now you could say, well, but he's got some really smart engineers out there, and they've got the algorithm, and the algorithm is manipulating people and so on. I mean, what the algorithm is doing is boosting tweets like Elon Musk's, right? I think I would just say I see very little evidence I see some evidence that Musk's control of Twitter has helped break up a kind of liberal consensus that prevailed on social media that was partially enforced by the rules that Twitter and Facebook were using. I see little evidence that it has converted tons and tons of formerly liberal social media users into populists or conservatives or anything like that, right? And people who don't like Elon Musk tweeting enough leave and go to a different social media platform. And Musk himself, this is the crucial point, is not popular, right? Donald Trump was popular when he was not Joe Biden and when he was running for president and was going on Joe Rogan and, promising no new wars and the side of Trump that presents a kind of moderate affect was popular. Trump in power has not been popular. I don't see strong evidence that a kind of algorithmic landscape has manufactured consent in some radically novel way. And in fact, I think there's a lot of evidence that it's just a lot less effective at that than the consolidated broadcast media environment of the 50s and 60s that Chomsky and others were writing about, which also failed to hold consent in the end, but I think was actually a little bit better at creating kind of large-scale consensus in American life. And similarly, there was an incredibly powerful, I would say, kind of establishment liberal attempt to first maintain the fiction that Joe Biden was competent to be president of the United States, and then to maintain the fiction that Kamala Harris was an incredibly dynamic candidate for president. Those efforts had, they had media behind them, they had, digital forces behind them, they had celebrities in Hollywood behind them, and they failed because, Joe Biden had to go out and debate, and everyone could see that he wasn't competent to be president, and, Kamala Harris in the end could not, in fact, win a majority of the popular vote. So I think you should have some confidence, right, that there's a kind of high version of what democracy does and a more modest version. And the high version, which I agree is ideal, involves a certain level of deliberation that may be slipping through our fingers, and I worry about a great deal. And I just worry about everything under AI conditions. That's like what I do all now is just worry about like what AI means for just about everything human. I'm really worried about that. But the lower version, where democracy is just a break on sort of extreme ideas consolidating power or failed politicians holding power when the public has turned against them, that seems just pretty stable to me. Like, I just don't see evidence that that either political coalition is using the new technologies in a way that suspend those rules. And again, if they were, you wouldn't have so many one-term presidents and swings of power back and forth. Those are the manifestations of the public recoiling over and over again from attempts at management and manipulation.
Very interesting. Thank you. Provost Quigley.
Thanks for those remarks, and I'll engage the podcast since, again, what struck me from the beginning with Vance of the kind of triumph of conservatism of a certain sort, with the most recent Jeremy Carl interview, there are a couple of moments that really jumped out at me. One where he invokes Schultz. It was biographical, but you don't get Schultz in that 80s, 90s consensus invoked too often. But then arguing that Trump is a moderating force, that he held off the forces of extremism in interesting ways, and you as a very generous, hospitable host didn't really engage on that point. But it led to me reflections on the accompanying crisis of conservatism in this era of liberalism that seems to be hollowed out or kind of soulless, struggling in its own ways. Puts me in mind when I was a graduate student, I was at a conference on the history of American conservatism at Princeton in 1996, their 250th anniversary. I was the only 19th century historian, and I always thought it was a little odd. I understood why, but certainly you need to understand the prehistory. The more I listen, reflect on, think about the last decade and what's coming in our politics is a question, does conservatism make sense as a category in 21st century American life, given the elite crisis and others that you've been talking about?
Yeah, no, I think there's a good case for using the term reaction in a non-pejorative way, if that's possible, which probably isn't, right? But I think it is totally reasonable to say that when you enter into a period of profound institutional crisis, that small c conservatism just tends to give way to a more reactionary form of right-wing politics, where people on the right say, well, look, what am I conserving or defending? These institutions don't work anymore. They're hostile to me and my views. I need to build something new, and that requires sort of reaching back into the past, and also going forward, right? But that becomes sort of the mode of right-wing politics. And there are ways in which things like fascism are themselves expressions of that. Fascism was a reactionary futurism, right? It had reactionary elements and futurist elements, and that was part of its appeal. I think, to your 19th century point, it's a mistake to just say, well, if conservatism collapses, we just get Mussolini. There was a long period across the 19th century of conservatives reckoning with the crisis of the order they were defending and trying out different forms of politics, reactionary, conservative, and everywhere in between. And I think that's the kind of era we're in. It may all be totally unsuccessful and disastrous, and for reasons, I don't think, in the interview he's describing, I don't think Carl is wrong. Like, Trump is a moderating force in some ways, right? And there is a version, clearly, of right-wing politics out there that is much more paranoid, conspiratorial, and anti-Semitic, racist, and so on than what Trump represents. And even in his own administration, like when it comes to Minneapolis, I think Trump was the moderating force, right? I think Trump was the guy saying, all right, let's walk this back. Let's, what's going on, Kristi Noem, right? I guess just to bring it back to my maybe childlike faith in democracy, I think that the kind of conservatism that goes, that after Trump goes, way, whatever you want to say, way conspiratorial, way that's like Candace Owens, right? Like, I just don't think Candace Owens could be elected president. And I know we said Donald Trump couldn't be elected president, right? But Donald Trump was a figure in his own way of the old mass media consensus environment. He was a guy who had been on TV as the host of The Apprentice, right? He was a guy who could play with extremism while also maintaining a kind of non-ideological businessman brand. That was crucial to his success. I think any kind of right-wing politics that comes after him to succeed will have to have some form of moderation to go with whatever kind of reactionary elements it has, if it actually wants to take and hold power. I don't think the crank podcast right is actually capable of taking power. And again, we can discuss it on Baffin Island together in the future. But I would also say, I think that there are ways to speak as a right-winger and as a conservative for a moment. From the conservative perspective, especially in certain elite institutions and elite universities, there was a feeling in 2020 and 2021 that we were living through a kind of left-wing extremist, a crazy takeover. And I'm not going to litigate all of that. I'm just going to say that was a very, very powerful feeling. If you were at all right of center and you worked in any elite institution in America in, let's say, the summer of 2020, you felt like you were in a kind of left-wing McCarthyite moment. Maybe wrongly, but that was the feeling. That feeling is gone now to me, 5 or 6 years later. Here I am running a podcast for the New York Times, interviewing some, very extreme and strange people. Not that, all of my guests are wonderful people, but I think that too, wokeness, whatever wokeness was or is, could not hold 300 million Americans in its grip for decades and decades, right? To the extent that it became extreme, the culture slipped through its fingers, Donald Trump came back, and so on. So I think you need again, this is where my AI fears come in. To get to an actual post-democratic age, you need some kind of incredibly profound social and technological disruption of a kind that we haven't actually lived through yet. But we could.
So I'm going to have to group the last 3 questions from second row, first row, and second row. Because we're running short on time. So please hold off on answering until all 3, and then we can try for a synthetic answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm a big fan, so I'm very excited to be able to listen to your talk. But I thought what you had to say about the elite kind of desire to exercise more control, leading to reactions in populism, and then that kind of just creating another reaction to exercise even more control. Really, really interesting. But I think a really good example of that is the elite impulse towards education, and kind of what we've been talking about all day, saying, oh, well, the reason that Donald Trump got elected again is because there was this lack of education, and then that causing a reaction from the people who are so-called uneducated. So I'm kind of just wondering, in reference to what you just said about kind of the woke era being over also, what your vision for inspiring education is going forward, and how we can kind of mediate that tension between elites wanting to educate people and then people feeling patronized by that, and if there's a hope for inspiring an education that's more well-rounded and less one-sided or pursuing a certain type of education.
Hi, thanks so much. Long-time listener, first-time caller. You ended your speech by distinguishing between our political crisis and our cultural crisis. And I wanted to follow up on that a bit, because one of the things I appreciate most about your writing is the attention you pay to culture, and in particular the political importance you place on there being kind of quality popular art. And it strikes me that in the 90s, when you began your story, there was a kind of monoculture in popular art. You'd see a movie poster, it's just got one person's face on it. On the bottom, it says Tom Cruise is the lawyer. And everyone that weekend sees the lawyer, and they talk about it at the water cooler, whereas today you tell people you're excited to watch the Oscars, they look at you like you collect stamps. So I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on how you see the relationship, if there is any, between the breakdown of our liberal political consensus and the breakdown of our cultural consensus? And do you see any hope, or can great art at all help restore our political consensus, or are these, is that too great a burden to place on it? Are these kind of algorithmic ways of distributing art and entertainment just too powerful, and this is all epiphenomenal? So thank you.
Such great questions. In the second row here.
Hi, Ross. Thank you so much for coming out. My question's brief. I was just wondering, how can we be optimistic about our democratic system when so many of our leaders in institutions that promote democracy, places like our government, institutions like Harvard, when so many of those leaders...
Not BC, just Harvard.
Well, you'll see where I'm going with this. When so many of those leaders, or what feels like so many of those leaders, were named in the Epstein files and have yet to be brought to justice properly by our government.
All right, let's work our way backward. So I was an Epstein paranoiac before it was fashionable. And I in the sense that like in around 2020, I had a really long conversation with a really smart, plugged-in person who I won't name, who basically convinced me that like the maximal scenario was true, that Mossad, that like Epstein was run by Mossad and was, had tapes of people and was, being used to blackmail figures. And I gave that like, relatively serious consideration for a long period of time. Because of that, to me, the latest round of Epstein disclosures has actually reduced the salience of it to me. Like, it seems to me like, number one, the evidence is that Epstein had some kind of ties to intelligence agencies and like saw himself as kind of like a player in world affairs and was connected to different groups in Israel, but probably was not actually running like some kind of complex blackmail operation. I don't think we have seen evidence for that. Similarly, most of the evidence around the sort of sexual misbehavior of elites associated with Epstein was, one, not sexual misbehavior, just a kind of like dismissal of his crimes, right? Like people who they're not accused of doing anything wrong, they're just accused of being friends with Epstein long after people knew he was a predator who had sex with underage girls, right? And that should reduce your confidence in those people and in the American elite, but no more so than like the career of Harvey Weinstein, or for that matter, the applause for Roman Polanski at the Oscars, right? Like, there really was a substantial change in American culture around the Me Too era in how people thought about sex and predation and so on. And it's okay to stand in judgment on people from before that era, or people who continued being friends with Epstein after the era, but it doesn't mean that they were all involved in like an Eyes Wide Shut type conspiracy with him. Then secondarily, there are people who clearly Epstein helped procure women for, but most of them, as far as I can tell, he was like essentially a pimp, procuring like prostitutes and women who were sort of prostitute adjacent, but not like underage women, girls, and children, right? So, and I think there's things in that area that have yet to fully come out. I don't believe, and probably there are cases where underage girls were involved. I don't think Prince Andrew is the only case. But again, I think it's like it's a disgusting window into elite misbehavior, but it's more like Harvey Weinstein, I would say, than it is, again, like Eyes Wide Shut. Have you seen Eyes Wide Shut? Okay, yeah. So that's my Epstein take that I will offer you. It should cause you to think less of the elite in all kinds of ways. And generally, you should be skeptical of elites. Elites are subjected to all kinds of temptations, and they often become elites because they're bad people. Not New York Times columnists were very virtuous, but the rest of them, they're bad, right? But that's also part of what a democratic culture generally, like, there is a healthy suspicion of elites that's okay. The trick is to find the place where you're like, okay, I have this healthy suspicion. I suspect a lot of people we elect to high office are bad people, but I'm gonna analyze and figure out and not go all the way to the most paranoid interpretation. And it's hard for people to do that. Like, this is something I've observed in all kinds of areas of my life. It's hard. Everyone should be a little bit conspiratorial about the world. There's like this much conspiracism that's really healthy and will help you understand reality. But maintaining it here and not letting it go to here is a big challenge, and I wish you good luck maintaining it. I'll put the other two together. So there is some connection here, right, where you need a healthy humanism in American life. It's not as simple as like a humanist culture will, be a better democracy or something. Obviously, there's plenty of counterexamples, and the Nazis listened to classical music and all the rest. But yeah, there is some kind of health of education, health of sort of popular culture, health of art that's connected to just what it means to have a good society. And I guess if I'm being a little bit optimistic on your first, so with AI, I think people on the left right now are underestimating how significant AI could be sometimes, but they're underestimating it for what I consider good humanist reasons. And I appreciate the kind of left-wing humanism that has bubbled up in response to AI, because there is also a kind of left-wing anti-humanism that's been a big part of left-wing discourse over the last 20 to 50 years that I would like to see go away, and I would like to see an alliance between left-wing humanists and right-wing humanists in the face of whatever AI is going to do to the culture. And one way that you might be able to tell that that alliance is working is when you get a popular culture that is sort of successfully generating mass artists with auteurist characteristics, which I think is what I associate with the movies, what I think you had in the late 1990s and early 2000s and don't have as much anymore. But all of that requires, it used to happen organically. It used to be the case that there were commercial imperatives and technological imperatives that led to mass market movies being made, right? That were sort of artful and yet sort of populist in their own way. And now the imperatives are different, and they're all towards fragmentation and niche audiences and, frankly, slop. And that's gonna be true in other ways in education too. And so these are examples of a larger issue, which extends to birth rates. There's all kinds of things that people did naturally in the past that for a good human society to survive, we have to do intentionally in the future. And how you get from, this is just something you do to this is something you are self-consciously doing, it's a really hard cultural challenge. But that's what the future requires. I think it applies to democracy itself. You have to think intentionally about democratic participation in ways that maybe you did not in the same degree in earlier stages in the Republic. But that's what we need. We need people where you do things because they are necessary to the survival of humanity, even though there isn't some sort of thing forcing you to do them. You have to choose. We have to choose our own survival. That's a good line to end on. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Ross. I think that there's an analogy also to be made between your recommendation of a sort of healthy dose of conspiracism and a healthy childlike belief in democracy. Because that is something that, and after today's panels on civic education and childhood education, in particular about democracy, this seems to me especially apt that part of what we are doing deliberately here, I think, is examining how we can intentionally make our democracies resilient. Thank you for being here. It was truly a profound and excellent talk. And thank you all for coming. Thank you, Joe. Appreciate it. And please visit our website. Please take a copy of our journal over there. Please apply for fellowships. They are due at the end of this month, applications. And we have a couple of more events. So I look forward to seeing you there. Thanks again.